8. The heyday of the Socialist Party, 1905 to 1914. The decade prior to the beginning of the First World War was a time of rapid growth and trustification of American industry, and also of imperialist expansionism. In the United States, as Lenin pointed out, the period of imperialism, in particular, the era of finance capital, the era of gigantic capitalist monopolies, the era of the transformation of simple trust capitalism into state trust capitalism, shows an unprecedented strengthening of the state and an unheard of development of the bureaucratic and military apparatus. Following up its victory in the Spanish-American War, American imperialism turned its chief attention to the conquest of Latin America, particularly the Caribbean area. American investments soared and American armed forces intervened directly in the life of many of the countries: Venezuela, Honduras, Haiti, Guatemala, Nicaragua, the Dominican Republic, and others. Cuba and Puerto Rico were held in colonial bondage. American aggression was one of the major factors that caused the Mexican Revolution, which began in 1910. Yankee imperialism was systematically pushing the older British imperialism aside in the Caribbean. But the biggest conquest for Wall Street during the period was the seizure of Panama and the building of the Panama Canal. The capitalists in the United States were busily grabbing the wealth of the country and its industries. In 1914, according to the report of an official government commission, 44 families have yearly incomes of $1 million or more, and less than 2 million of the people own 20% more of the nation's wealth than all the other go millions. The rich 2% own 60% of the wealth, the middle class 3% own 35%, and the poor 65% own but 5%. The wholesale capitalist robbery of the people was enforced through a complete control of the government and through elaborate systems of espionage and gunmen in the company towns of the basic industries. The conditions of the workers. While generally the skilled workers of these times had considerably higher wages than those prevailing in other countries, the masses of the unskilled, unorganized, foreign-born workers, who made up the great majority of the workers in nearly all the trustified industries, were forced down to a bare subsistence level. The noted report of the Commission on Industrial Relations pointed out, it is certain that at least one-third and possibly one-half of the families of wage earners employed in manufacturing and mining earn in the course of the year less than enough to support them in anything like a comfortable and decent condition, p. 10. And, no better proof of the miserable condition of the mass of American workers need be sought than the fact that in recent years laborers in large numbers have come to this country only from Russia, Italy, Austria-Hungary, and the backward and impoverished nations of Southern and Eastern Europe, p. 3. And, have the workers secured a fair share of the enormous increase in wealth which has taken place in this country, during the period, as a result largely of their labors? The answer is emphatically, no, p. 8. On the eve of World War I, women worked for about 2% less than men. Child labor was a great national evil, and the Negro toilers, barred from many industries and trade unions, were by far the worst off of all. Owing to the employers' boundless greed, the industries were also literal slaughterhouses for the workers, the Commission on Industrial Relations stating, approximately 35,000 persons were killed last year in American industry, and at least half of these deaths were preventable, p. 46. The Commission suggested that the situation might be improved if the capitalists were held criminally responsible for such needless deaths. Working hours ranged up to 12 per day, 7 days per week, steel, railroads, etc., with relatively few workers having the 8-hour day, coal mining, building, printing, etc. In many localities, the immigrant workers' homes were mere bunkhouses, each working shift taking its turn in bed. The workers had little or no financial protection from industrial accidents, nor was there any trace of insurance protection against old age and sickness. The workers were also fully exposed to the terrors of joblessness through economic crises. The government, in all its branches, actively sustained this brutal exploitation. The workers, says the Commission's report, have an almost universal conviction that they, both as individuals and as a class, are denied justice in the enactment, adjudication, and administration of law, p. 38. And, it is quite clear that the 14th Amendment not only has failed to operate to protect personal rights but has operated almost wholly for the protection of the property rights of corporations, p. 56. The fight of the trade unions. The pre-World War I period that we are dealing with was one of an intense offensive against labor and the people by the greedy and arrogant monopolists. It was also a time of intensive counter-offensive by the working class against intolerable working and living conditions, a period of fierce strikes and of rapid growth of the workers' economic and political organizations. During these years the AFL and railroad unions, despite the Gompercite theories of class collaboration, conducted many bitterly fought struggles. These were precipitated by the militant fighting spirit of the workers. The strikes were intensified by the economic crises of 1907 and 1913. Among the more important of the current strikes were those of the shirtwaist girls in New York in 190 grams and the cloakmakers in New York and the men's clothing workers in Chicago in 1910, the National Harriman Railroad strike in 1911, the desperate fight to organize the West Virginia coal miners in 1913, the Calumet copper mine strike of the same year, and the murderous Colorado coal strike of 1914. In all these strikes, the left wing was active. Everywhere the employers used the utmost violence. During the Calumet copper strike, a company gunman shouted, "Fire!" in a hall crowded with strikers' children, and 73 were crushed to death in the panic. The employers continued, too, to harpoon the unions in the political field, notably in the famous Danbury Hatters and Buck Stove and Range anti-boycott injunction cases. The first case led to a fine of $232,000 against the workers, and the latter case brought about the indictment, but not jailing, of Gompers, Morrison, and Mitchell, the top AFL leaders. The politically and personally corrupt Gompersite leaders met this employer's onslaught in their usual spirit of retreat and surrender. Basing themselves principally upon the skilled workers and upon collaboration with employers, they rejected every proposal to establish industrial unionism, they voted down repeated moves for a labor party. And they broke their own strikes with the outrageous system of union scabbing, that is, part of the unions in a given industry working while the rest were striking. Their one feeble reply to the onslaught of capital was, in 1907, the outlining of what was called Labor's Bill of Grievances. This series of timid legislative proposals finally resulted, in 1914, in the passage of the Clayton Act, which was supposed to shield organized labor from the Sherman Antitrust Law, but did not. If during this period the membership of the AFL advanced from 1,676,200 in 1904 to 2,020,671 in 1914, this was due very largely to the efforts of the rank-and-file socialists in the trade unions and to the effects of the big IWW strikes, but not to the work of the overpaid and corrupt AFL leadership. Two famous labor cases developed during this stormy decade. The first was the arrest, in February 1906, of Moyer, Haywood, and Pettibone, national officers of the Western Federation of Miners, who were charged with the bomb killing of Governor Frank Steunenberg of Idaho in December 1905. After a bitter court fight which attracted national attention, this notorious frame-up was defeated and the three defendants were triumphantly acquitted. The second big labor case was that of the two McNamara brothers, James and John, and eventually Matt Schmidt and David Kaplan. The McNamaras were arrested in April 1911 and charged with dynamiting the Los Angeles Times building during a fierce struggle between the National Erectors Association and the Structural Iron Workers Union. The two brothers, after being betrayed into pleading guilty, served long terms in California penitentiaries. James B. McNamara died in prison after being there 29 years. Several years before he died, this indomitable fighter became a communist. Regarding the aggressions of American imperialism in Latin America, the AFL leaders, who in 1898 had vigorously opposed the seizure of the Philippines and expansion, generally, had radically changed their position. They were now imperialistically minded themselves. Identifying their interests with those of the capitalists, they condoned Wall Street's infringement upon the sovereignty of the peoples to the south. In particular, their pro-imperialist meddling in the Mexican Revolution during these years was a deterrent to that great movement. The SP and the IWW, however, took more of a militant position against Wall Street's interventions, and particularly in support of the Mexican Revolution. The struggle of the IWW. The IWW played a most important part during these immediate pre-war, pre-communist party years. At its foundation in June 1 Goss, the organization was largely socialist, but shortly thereafter it began to develop an anarcho-syndicalist, anti-political orientation. Already at the 1907 convention an unsuccessful attempt was made to strike out the endorsement of political action from the IWW preamble. In the 1908 convention, the direct actionists, mostly floating workers from the West, who were led by Vincent Street, John and William L. Troutman, were in control, and they deleted altogether the hated political clause. Thenceforth, the organization was to place its reliance upon the general strike, sabotage, and other methods of direct action. More and more it took an anti-Marxist position in ensuing years. This move of the IWW into syndicalism alienated the political socialists. The WF quit the IWW during the first year, Debs withdrew shortly afterward, and the break with De Leon came in 1908. De Leon later organized the Workers' International Industrial Union, which was similar to the old STLA. The turn of the IWW to syndicalism was to be explained by a number of factors, including a. the disfranchised condition of many millions of foreign-born workers, b. the workers' disgust at the opportunist political policies of the A.F. of L and SP leaders, c. the current widespread corruption in American political life, d. the influx of consciously anarchist elements. As we have seen, roughly similar forces had combined to produce anarcho-syndicalism in Parsons' Chicago movement of the 1880s. A further important element in creating IWW syndicalism was the long-continued influence of De Leonism itself. De Leon in his theorizing constantly played down the role of the party and exaggerated that of the industrial unions before, during, and after the revolution. Street, John and the other anti-parliamentarians and direct actionists of the IWW, by eliminating the party altogether from their program, simply carried De Leon's ideas to their logical conclusion. Notwithstanding all his eventual denunciations of the IWW, De Leon was in truth the ideological father of anarcho-syndicalism in the United States. The IWW during this pre-war decade conducted many important and hard-fought strikes at Goldfield, McKees Rocks, Lawrence, Akron, Patterson, New Bedford, Chicago, Little Falls, and in various parts of Louisiana, Minnesota, California, and Washington. These strikes were mostly among metal miners, lumber workers, textile workers, farm workers, and construction workers, largely foreign-born. The IWW also led many courageous local fights for the right to speak on the streets to the workers, in Spokane, San Diego, Denver, Kansas City, Sioux City, Omaha, and elsewhere. During these fights many hundreds of members were slugged and jailed by vigilante police gangs. The WW became the very symbol of indomitable, fighting proletarian spirit. During this period WW militants were barbarously framed and prosecuted. Among the more outrageous of many such cases were those of Preston and Smith, Nevada, 1907, 25 and 10 years, Klein and Rangel, Texas, 1913, 25 years to life, Ford and Sir, California, 1913, life imprisonment. And, most shocking of all, Joe Hill, celebrated IWW songwriter, Utah, November 19, 1915, executed on a false murder charge. The IWW won, or half-won, most of its bitterly contested struggles. Nevertheless, by 1914 it had organized only about 100,000 members. Already it was sharply displaying many of the internal weaknesses which were eventually to prove fatal to its growth and development. Among the more crucial of these weaknesses were its destructive head-on collision with the trade unions and the Socialist Party, its failure to cultivate the political struggle of the working class, its reckless use of the general strike, its incorrect handling of the religious question, the "No God, No Master" slogan in Lawrence, its anarchistic decentralization, which prevented all solid organization, its identification with sabotage, its reliance upon spontaneity, and its sectarian insistence, among conservative workers, upon their acceptance of its syndicalist conception of the revolution. Growth of the Socialist Party. In all the strikes, free speech fights, labor cases, and political struggles of this period, the left-wing worker fighters of the Socialist Party were in the front line. The dominant intellectuals patronizingly called them the Jimmy Higginses, of the movement. That is, they did the work and the fighting, while the petty bourgeois leadership got the credit and held the party's official posts. A good example of the militancy of the left wing was the great fight it waged to save Moyer, Haywood, and Pettibone. For example, Drive, Herman Titus, long the outstanding left-wing leader on the Pacific Coast, moved his paper, the Seattle Socialist, to Boise, Idaho, the trial center, and published it from there, making the great trial almost its sole subject. The appeal to reason also carried on a tremendous campaign for the accused. In his famous appeal article, "Arise Ye Slaves," the fiery Debs declared, "If they attempt to murder Moyer, Haywood, and their brothers, a million revolutionists, at least, will meet them with guns." In consequence of its many activities in the sharp class struggle of the period, the party grew rapidly in numbers and influence. By 1912, the high watermark achieved by the SP, the party had some 120,000 members. Pennsylvania was the banner state, with 12,000. The party had a powerful base in the trade unions. There was also strong organization among the Western farmers. In this same year Max Hayes of the Typographical Union ran for president of the A.F. of L and received 5,073 convention votes as against Gomper's 11,974. At this time, supporting the SP were the following A.F. of L unions: brewery, hat and cap makers, ladies' garment workers, bakery, fur, machinists, tailors, and Western Federation of Miners. There were also large socialist contingents among the leadership of the coal miners, flint glass, painters, carpenters, brick, electrical, printers, cigar makers, and other unions. The Socialists likewise led many local and state councils of the A.F. of L, and they were generally a rapidly growing force in the unions. The SP was also expanding its activity into many new fields. In 190% the Intercollegiate Socialist Society was formed. In 1906 the Rand School was established, and in 1913 the Young People's Socialist League was organized. Very special attention was also paid to winning over the preachers, the Christian Socialists being a strong force in the party. The party carried on some work among women. In 1908 a National Women's Commission was set up. The same year the Socialist Women of the East Side in New York organized a suffrage demonstration on March 8, a date which later on became International Women's Day. Neglect of women's historical struggle for the vote, and underestimation of women's work in general, however, characterized both the SLP and SP. There were, nevertheless, many outstanding women workers in the Socialist Party. The party had considerable election success. In 1910 Emile Seidel was elected mayor of Milwaukee, and 6 months later Victor Berger was elected as the first socialist in Congress from the same district. The party in this period elected 56 mayors in Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, Montana, and New England, as well as 300 councilmen. In 1912 some 1,039 dues-paying party members were holding elected offices. The presidential campaign of 1912, with Debs and Seidel as the candidates, resulted in a big advance for the party. The vote, 897,011, being the highest polled by the party up to that time. The SP also built up a strong press. In 1912 the party had 323 periodicals. Among these were 5 English and 8 non-English dailies, 262 English and 36 non-English weeklies, and 10 English and 2 non-English monthlies. The most important of these papers were the International Socialist Review, with about 200,000 circulation, Jewish Daily Forward, 200,000, National Ripsaw, 200,000, Wilshire's Magazine, 270,000, and the Appeal to Reason, 500,000. The latter weekly, which then claimed the biggest circulation of any socialist paper in the world, was owned by J. A. Wayland and edited by Fred D. Warren, with Debs a frequent contributor. It was a very aggressive organ, with a mixed policy of opportunist socialism, populism, and militant unionism. During 1912 it circulated 36,091,000 copies. It concentrated on large special editions. The Big, Moyer Haywood, and Debs Reply to Roosevelt editions ran to 3 million copies each. It took 4 solid mail trains of 10 cars apiece to transport each of these immense issues. The Appeal had behind it a devoted, organized army of up to 80,000 workers and farmers. During this general period an internal development took place in the SP which was destined to have a profound effect upon the party's future. This was the organization of the national groups, or language federations. The opportunist leaders of the party, with eyes fastened upon the skilled workers and the middle classes, characteristically paid little or no attention to party organization work among the many millions of voteless, non-English-speaking immigrants. As a result the socialist workers among these groups themselves took up their own organization along national lines. Thus, successively, there developed national federations of Finns, 1907, Letts, 1908, South Slavs, 1911, Italians, 1911, Scandinavians, 1911, Hungarians, 1912, Bohemians, 1912, Germans, 1913, Poles, 1913, Jews, 1913, Slovaks, 1913, Ukrainians, 1915, Lithuanians, 1915, Russians, 1915. These groups, largely unskilled workers in the basic industries, developed highly organized movements, with elaborate papers, cooperatives, and educational institutions. Gradually, the federations, at first independent, became affiliated to the SP, to begin with, loosely as national groups, but finally also as individual members and branches. Each language group had a translator secretary in the SP headquarters. By 1912 the federations had added some 20,000 very important proletarian members to the SP. Renaissance of the Negro Liberation Movement. The period 1905 to 14, among its many important developments, brought about a new resurgence of struggle by the Negro people, the most important since the crushing of the Negro people during the Reconstruction years following the Civil War. American monopoly capitalism, imperialism, with its generally accentuated reaction, was having catastrophic effects upon the persecuted and oppressed Negro people in the South. Among these reactionary consequences were the repeal of the so-called force bills by Congress in 1894, the adoption all over the South of a whole series of Jim Crow laws relegating the Negro people to a position of semi-serfdom, the radical decline of land ownership in the South by Negroes, the rebirth of Ku Klux Klan terrorism, and the betrayal of the populist movement in the South by such opportunists as Tom Watson and Ben Tillman. Particularly contemptible was the Jim Crow attitude of the Southern white churches, which evidently looked forward to a lily-white heaven. During 1888 to 1900, there was an average of 165 Negro lynchings yearly. Bravely the Negro people fought against all this persecution. The greatly increased capitalist pressure upon the Negro people provoked sharp reactions from them. The first important expression of this was the organization of the Niagara Movement in 1905. This movement was headed by the noted scholar W. E. B. Du Bois, and it sounded a ringing note of militant struggle for the Negro masses. Previously, from the early 90s on, Booker T. Washington had been the most outstanding spokesman of the Negro people. Through his Tuskegee movement, he maintained that the Negro masses' path to progress was through improvement of their economic position by cultivating their skills and developing a strong middle class. He combated all struggle for social equality as extremist folly. Washington was quite popular among white reformers and philanthropists. Andrew Carnegie, for example, gave him $600,000 for Tuskegee Institute. The Niagara movement collided head-on with Washington's economic, political, and social doctrines. It rejected his policy of retreat and submission. "We shall not be satisfied with less than full manhood rights," its leaders declared. They demanded an end to all discrimination and insisted upon social equality. The modern Negro liberation movement can be said to have started with the Niagara agitation, which greatly alarmed the bourgeoisie. In 1909, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People was founded. This was an alliance of Negro middle-class intellectuals and their white friends, mostly liberals and a few socialists. Its line was to secure civil rights justice in the courts and equal economic, trade union, and social opportunities. It fought against lynching and the poll tax. In 1910, the Niagara movement merged with the NAACP. The National Urban League was established in 1911. A number of socialist leaders helped to form these organizations. The growing Negro liberation movement was, however, primarily the creation of the Negro middle class. The workers were not the vital factor in it that they were to become later. The organized Negro masses were also largely isolated from the general labor and socialist movement. The AFL leadership, reeking with race prejudice, freely tolerated and encouraged unions with lily-white clauses in their constitutions. The railroad brotherhoods were even worse, all of them barring Negro workers from the unions and seeking to force them out of the railroad service. The IWW, however, took a much more advanced position. Haywood and the other leaders roundly condemning all manifestations of Jim Crow. The IWW, Brotherhood of Timber Workers, which conducted important strikes in the lumber industry of Louisiana during 1911-12, was composed about 50% of Negroes. Ben Fletcher, Philadelphia longshoreman, was the outstanding Negro leader in the IWW. The SP, under its petty bourgeois leadership, virtually ignored the hardships and struggles of the Negro people. It held to the incorrect theory that the Negro was persecuted not because of his color, but only because he was a worker. The few Negroes who joined the party in the South were placed in segregated locals. The party conducted no campaign to halt the frightful campaign of lynching which was raging throughout the South. This SP indifference to the oppression of the Negro people, as previously remarked, was largely due to white chauvinism, which is white supremacist Jim Crow. The extent to which this reactionary poison affected the SP middle-class leadership was shockingly illustrated during the debate on Chinese exclusion at the SP National Congress in 1910. The upshot of the discussion was that the party, aligning itself with the corrupt AFL bureaucracy and in the face of strong opposition from Debs and other left-wingers, went on record with a weasel-worded resolution not to admit to this country Chinese and other Asian peoples who might reduce American living standards. Lenin sharply condemned this action, and even the opportunist Second International could not stomach it, publicly criticizing the American Socialist Party. During this notorious debate, various right-wing leaders freely came forth with chauvinistic expressions, hardly to be outdone by the most rabid white supremacists. For example, the extreme right-winger, Ernest Unterman, who made the Minority Report at the convention, declared that the question as to what race shall dominate the globe must be met as surely as the question as to what class shall dominate the world. We should neglect our duty to the coming generation of Aryan peoples if we did not do everything in our power, even today, to ensure the final race victory of our own people. Formation of the Syndicalist League. The Syndicalist League of North America was formed in March 1912, with William Z. Foster as National Secretary and with headquarters in Chicago. The League was primarily a split-off from the IWW. Foster, after a year's study of the labor movement in France and Germany, during 1909-10, had become convinced that the IWW's policy of dual unionism was wrong. Returning to the United States, he pointed out that the effects of this dual unionism were to isolate the militants from the masses and to fortify the control of the Gompers bureaucracy in the old unions. He proposed that the IWW should consolidate with the trade unions and devote itself to building the militant minority there in order to revolutionize these bodies. Frank Little was among those who agreed with Foster, but the IWW as a whole would not hear of his policy. Foster, along with a few other militants, therefore, launched the new industrial organization. The League was not Marxist, it was syndicalist, modeled after the French Confederation of Labor. It advocated the general strike, industrial unionism, sabotage, anti-parliamentarism, anti-statism, anti-militarism, anti-clericalism, and an aggressive fighting policy. The SLNA had a distinct position of its own, however, in disputing the current syndicalist conception that the industrial unions would be the basis of the future society, taking the stand that labor unions were not producing bodies and that industry in the future would develop its own specific industrial organizations. The SLNA established about a dozen branches from Chicago westward, including a couple in Western Canada. It carried on numerous strikes and organizing activities, and it produced 4 papers: The Syndicalist in Chicago, The Toiler in Kansas City, The Unionist in Omaha, and The Internationalist in San Diego. Tom Mooney was a member of the organization, and he established a flourishing national section in the Molders Union. Tom Mann of England, in 1913, made a highly successful national tour of the United States for the League. The anarchist movement, Goldman-Berkman Group, then almost completely decayed, tried to exploit the rising sentiment for French syndicalism. In Mother Earth, on September 30, 1912, Alexander Berkman and others published a call for the establishment of a syndicalist league, but nothing came of it. The League petered out in 1914. Its death was primarily due to its incorrect syndicalist program. Its position against dual unionism was sound, but the left wing in the IWW and SP was too deeply imbued with dual unionism to pay heed to the League's arguments for working within the old unions. Particularly so, as at this time the IWW was carrying through a series of spectacular strikes. It is difficult to conceive now of how fervently the left wing at that time believed in dual unionism. Bill Haywood said, "The 28,000 local unions of the AFL are 28,000 agencies of the capitalist class," and he added that he would rather cut off his right arm than belong to the AFL. Vincent Street John declared that, "The American Federation of Labor is not now and never can become a labor movement." De Leon stated that, "The American Federation of Labor is neither American, nor a federation, nor of labor." Joe Eder, Lawrence strike organizer, declared that it is the first duty of every revolutionist to destroy the AFL. Debs poured out a constant denunciation of the old craft unions and glorification of the dual industrial unions, and early in 1914 he called, in vain, for the establishment of a new labor movement, based upon an amalgamation of the UMWA, the WFM, and a regenerated IWW? With such deep-seated convictions on dual unionism saturating the entire left wing, there was no place for the SLNA policy of boring from within the old unions. The SLNA's anti-politics was also a big factor against it. The New Freedom and the Square Deal. The big capitalists, greatly alarmed by the current growth of the trade unions, the IWW, and the Socialist Party during this period, in 1912 greatly elaborated their bourgeois reformism, in addition to their already extensive methods of breaking strikes, smashing unions, and generally fighting the advance of the working class. Thus was born in Democratic Party ranks the New Freedom of Woodrow Wilson, and in Republican circles the Square Deal of Theodore Roosevelt. Wilson, with his anti-red demagogy, cried, "We are on the verge of a revolution," at the same time warning the people against the domination of the trusts. In general terms, he promised the people a new freedom, which, of course, failed to materialize. Roosevelt went even further than Wilson in his demagogy. With the Steel Trust behind him and sensing the need for a reform campaign, Roosevelt tried to get the Republican Party to write a few liberal planks into its platform. When he failed in this, he seceded and launched the Progressive Party, with himself and Hiram Johnson as presidential candidates. This was the Bull Moose Square Deal ticket. Roosevelt's program called for many reforms. He said, "We stand for the most advanced factory legislation. We will introduce state control over all the trusts, in order that there should be no poverty, in order that everyone shall receive decent wages. We will establish social and industrial justice. We bow and pay homage to all reforms. There is one reform and one only that we do not want, and that is the expropriation of the capitalists." In the three-cornered big party fight, Wilson won the election, with 1 million short of a majority, but with 435 electoral votes, against 88 for Roosevelt and 8 for Taft. The SP, as we have seen, in spite of the double-barreled demagogy from the old party candidates, pulled its largest vote up till then. The Progressive Party died after the campaign. Lenin recognized the importance of the 1912 election, stating, "The significance of the election is an unusually clear and striking manifestation of bourgeois reformism as a means of struggle against socialism." Roosevelt has been obviously hired by the clever billionaires to preach this fraud. The extreme right-wing elements in the SP, on the other hand, began to see in this bourgeois reformism progressive capitalism, and, thus, a step toward socialism. Walling, for example, stated that bourgeois reform leads to state capitalism, hailed its coming as a basic step forward, like the growth of the trusts. He said that Certainly the socialist platform did not go any further than Roosevelt's unqualified phrase that the people should control industry collectively. Both the socialists and the Lafayette progressives complained that Roosevelt stole their thunder. Organized labor stayed aside from the movement, seeing in it a sort of neo-Republican party. Lefts versus rights in the party. From its very beginning the Socialist Party, as indicated earlier, was a prey to the numerous middle-class intellectuals and businessmen. Increasingly, they descended upon it, lawyers, doctors, preachers, dentists, journalists, professors, small employers, and even a few priests. Such people as these were Hillquit, Berger, Harriman, Wilson, Unterman, Hone, Wilshire, Wayland, Russell, Mills, Frank and William Bone, Simons, Ghent, and others. By 1908 there were 300 preachers in the party, with other professional groups in proportion. There was also a substantial group of millionaire socialists, Stokes, Walling, Lloyd, Patterson, Hunter, and company. These non-proletarian elements, plus certain conservative socialist union leaders, Barnes, Johnston, Germer, Maurer, Walker, Schlesinger, and others, progressively fastened their grip upon the party as the years went by. The national secretaries of the party, from 1901 to 1914, Leon Greenbaum, W. Maley, J. M. Barnes, and J. M. Work, functioned in harmony with the middle-class leadership. There is a proper and effective place in the Marxist Party for middle-class intellectuals. They can help especially in its theoretical development, but this only upon the condition that they get rid of their petty bourgeois illusions and identify themselves completely with the immediate and ultimate aims of the proletariat. Few of those in the SP, however, did this. The bulk of them clung to their reformism and thus comprised the right wing of the party. Their deleterious influence was not lessened by the fact that many of them, including Hillquit himself, had proletarian backgrounds. On this general question, Lenin said, in speaking of the development of class consciousness among the workers, this consciousness could only be brought from without. The history of all countries shows that the working class, exclusively by its own effort, is able to develop only trade union consciousness. 7. Euro. It may realize the necessity for combining in unions, to fight against the employers and to strive to compel the government to pass necessary labor legislation, etc. The theory of socialism, however, grew out of the philosophic, historical, and economic theories that were elaborated by the educated representatives of the propertied classes, the intellectuals. The founders of modern socialism, Marx and Engels, themselves belonged to the bourgeois intellectuals. As we have previously remarked, these right-wing elements generally tended toward Bernsteinism. Their whole attention was devoted to parliamentary opportunism. They proposed to buy out the industries, and to them municipal and government ownership under capitalism amounted to socialism. They were post office socialists. Their whole tendency was to kill the proletarian fighting spirit of the membership and to transform the party into one of middle-class reform. Among the dominant petty bourgeois intellectuals were a group of centrists, Hillquit, Stokes, Hunter, et al. Radical in words, the latter elements, when it came to a showdown, traditionally served as a fig leaf to cover up the political nakedness of the right opportunists. The SP intellectuals produced many books and pamphlets, but not one important Marxist work. The many books of Myers, Russell, and Sinclair, although full of valuable factual material, were only a little above the bourgeois reformist muckraking of Steffens, Tarbell, and others of the period. Hillquit's and Bodine's writings were but academic Marxism, and those of Simons and O'Neill presented an opportunist conception of American history. Ghent's benevolent feudalism was something of a contribution, but quite important among the SP writings was The Iron Heel by Jack London, a book which foresaw, in a sense, the eventual development of fascism. The SP, like the SLP before it, had a sectarian attitude toward American bourgeois culture. Its leaders, despite the contrary policies of Marx and Engels, and later of Lenin and Stalin, systematically ignored or deprecated the work of this country's scientists, inventors, artists, novelists, and democratic thinkers. It was only after the advent of the Communist Party, under the teachings of Lenin, that a correct Marxist attitude toward bourgeois culture began to be developed. From the outset of the SP, the working-class membership, who wanted to make the party into a fighting, proletarian party heading toward socialism, tended to conflict sharply with the opportunists who controlled the party. This growing left wing was the direct forerunner of the Communist Party. Its struggles were not without considerable progressive influence upon the party's policies, particularly in the earlier years. Numerous collisions between the right and left took place in various cities and states. The traditional handicap of the young left wing in these fights was its lack of a sound program, free of sectarianism. The first crucial struggle developed in the state of Washington, coming to a split at the Everett Convention, held in July 1909. The leader of the left was Dr. Herman F. Titus, editor of the Seattle Socialist and for many years an outstanding national left leader in the party. The local leader of the right wing was Dr. E. J. Brown, a rank opportunist. Alfred Wagener and William Z. Foster were both members of the local SP in Seattle during this significant fight. The immediate cause of the split was a fight over control of the convention, but the basic reason was a long-developing opposition generally among the left-wingers to petty bourgeois domination of the SP. The outcome was a split and then two socialist parties in the state. The National Executive Committee recognized the right-wing forces in Washington, although the left clearly had a majority. Consequently, the latter found themselves outside the party, most of them, including Foster, never to return. The expelled left wing, those who did not commit themselves entirely to the IWW, formed the Wage Workers' Party, with Joseph S. Biscay as secretary. This party, which perished shortly, was typically ultra-leftist. It laid particular stress upon the fact that it confined its membership solely to proletarians, specifically excluding lawyers, preachers, doctors, detectives, soldiers, policemen, and capitalists. It published but one issue of its journal, The Wage Worker, in September 1910, before it died. Dr. Titus, with a grim logic, abandoned his profession and became a proletarian. Foster and many other expelled members, upon the demise of the WWP, joined the IWW. The SP split in 1912. The next big clash between left and right in the SP came at the party's convention in May 1912, held in Indianapolis. This marked a new high stage in the development of the left wing, parent of the eventual Communist Party. The convention fight involved the whole line of the party, including the perennial matter of petty bourgeois leadership. The fight at the convention, however, boiled down to two basic questions: sabotage and industrial unionism. The right wing undoubtedly came to the convention determined to crush the left wing, which with the growth of the IWW and the development of the language federations, was threatening the control of the petty bourgeois intellectuals, as well as their whole opportunist political policy. To this end, among their other preparations, they invited the opportunist German Social Democrat, Karl Liebknecht, to make a rabid anti-left speech at the convention. The big struggle occurred over the question of sabotage. The IWW and the left wing in the SP, following the example of the French and Italian syndicalists, had been laying some stress upon sabotage as an important working-class weapon. The right wing at the 1912 convention, with Hillquit in the chair, made its main attack upon this issue, proposing the following amendment to the Constitution, the well-known Article 2, Section 6. Any member of the party who opposes political action or advocates crime, sabotage, or other methods of violence as a weapon of the working class to aid in its emancipation, shall be expelled from membership in this party. While the right wing concentrated its main assault upon sabotage, which should not have been defended by the left wing as a working class weapon in the daily class struggle, its main objective was to destroy the revolutionary perspective and militancy generally of the left wing of the party. The rights, in this historic fight, were intensifying their drive to make the party into simply an election machine with an opportunist program. This was the real meaning of the amendment, and it was made quite clear in the discussions. If most of the left wing voted against the amendment, this was primarily for the purpose of preserving the fighting spirit of the party, then under attack from the right wing, rather than an endorsement of sabotage as a working-class tactic. Marxists, on principle, condemn not only sabotage, but also syndicalism generally, as a destructive tendency in the class struggle. The previous SP convention of 1908, with but one dissenting vote, had rejected the use or advocacy of force and violence. After a very bitter fight, the new clause was adopted by a vote of 190 to GI. The rights then pushed through a trade union resolution which evaded the burning issue of industrial unionism and virtually adopted a policy of neutrality on trade union questions, a resolution for which the left wing mistakenly voted. The rights even tried to defeat Debs for the presidential nomination, but in this case they were frustrated. C. E. Ruthenberg, eventual chief founder of the Communist Party, was an active left-wing delegate at this convention. After their victory at the convention, the rights carried the war to the lefts by filing fake charges against Bill Haywood, alleging that he had violated the amended Constitution by advocating force and violence in a public speech. This false charge was rammed through by a national referendum, which the rights won by a vote of 22,000 to 11,000. Haywood was thus recalled from the National Committee, whereupon he quit the party. Without any formal split, many thousands of socialist workers soon followed Haywood's example. The effects of the split provoked by the right wing were almost catastrophic for the party. In May 1912, the party had numbered 150,000 members, although the average for the same year was 120,000, but in 4 months' time it had dropped by 40,000. The party also immediately went into a financial crisis. By 1915, the party's membership had tobogganed to 79,374, and in 1916, with Benson as the candidate and with Debs refusing to run, its national vote was but 585,113, a falling off of over 300,000 since 1912. In its policies the party moved rapidly toward the right. Thenceforth, for example, it put up no more candidates against Gompers at AFL conventions, and it soon dropped its practice of introducing resolutions there for industrial unionism. The Socialist Party's opportunist leaders were now well on the way to their eventual tight alliance with the Gompers reactionaries. The SP was never able to recover fully from the 1912 split. The status of the left wing. On the eve of World War I, the broad left wing, although greatly increased in strength over earlier years, was still lacking in developed leadership, solid organization, and a correct political line. There were three streams or segments in the growing left forces which were later to form the Communist Party. The major one was the left wing in the SP. Then there were the Marxist forces in the 1WW, and finally, the militants of the Syndicalist League. The real mass leader of the SP left wing during this crucial period was William D. Haywood. Born in Salt Lake City in 1869, Haywood was a fighting metal miner. He became Secretary-Treasurer of the Western Federation of Miners in 1901. His trial in 1907 gave him enormous prestige, and from then on he was the most dynamic figure on the left. He was a bold, dogged battler, although not a theoretician. He always recognized the workers' enemies, whether employers, capitalist politicians, labor fakers, or opportunist socialists. And he fought them all relentlessly, with indomitable courage and without giving or asking quarter. Eugene V. Debs, too, was of the left. He was a militant trade union fighter, a pioneer industrial unionist, a fiery and brilliant orator who boldly challenged capitalism and who did more than any other in his time to popularize socialism among the masses. He was an important forerunner of the Communist Party, despite the fact that, old and sick when the party was formed, he did not grasp its significance and never joined it. A great weakness of Debs was his theoretical inadequacy. Also, while he courageously and tirelessly attacked the capitalists, he did not systematically attack their reflection in the party, the right wing of the party. He never attended party conventions, nor did he accept any official party posts until his final years. He never understood the basic anti-socialist character of the Hillquits and Burgers. Haywood finally became a communist, while Debs did not. Two other men, eventually to become left-wing leaders, began to function nationally in this period. These were Charles Emile Ruthenberg and William Z. Foster. Ruthenberg, a former carpenter, who joined the party in 1909, was already a power in Ohio, and he played a big part in the ranks of the left at the SP 1912 convention. Foster, a railroad worker, had belonged to the party from 1900 to the split in 1909, and was now busily organizing the left-wing forces within the old trade unions. There were many outstanding women in this pre-war period, among them such well-known left-wing SP fighters as Mary Marcy, Kate Sadler, Greenhalgh, Rose Pastor Stokes, Anita Whitney, Margaret Prevey, Jeanette Pearl, and others. Especially to be mentioned are Mother Mary Jones, an early SP member and noted United Mine Workers organizer, who, when she died in 1930 at the age of 100, for almost 3/4 of a century had been in the forefront of all big strikes in every industry. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, nationally known IWW speaker and leader, now a member of the National Committee of the Communist Party, who was very active in the IWW all through its heroic period, and Mother Ella Reeve Blower, who died August 10, 1951, at the age of 89, and who had been an active organizer in socialist ranks since 1897. The national left wing rallied principally, in an organizational sense, around the International Socialist Review. But it was by no means a clear-cut Marxist journal. This monthly paper, founded in 1901, was edited by A. M. Simons until 1908, when he resigned and the Bill Haywood Charles H. Kerr Mary Marcy group took over completely. Here and there in the localities, the left wing also had more or less control over local papers, such as the Socialist in Cleveland, and in 1914-15, the New Review, a left organ of middle-class intellectuals, was published in New York. The program of the developing left wing left much to be desired from a Marxist standpoint. As we have seen, the line of the IWW and also that of the SLNA was purely syndicalist. The policies of the left forces in the SP were also very heavily tinctured with syndicalism and Leonist leftism. There was, however, a qualitative difference between the SP left wing and the syndicalists. The SP left wing based itself upon the writings of Marx and Engels, called itself Marxist, believed in a workers' political party, and carried on political action, although sectarian, to all of which the syndicalists were diametrically opposed. The most authoritative statement of the SP left's program in this period was the pamphlet, Industrial Socialism, published by Charles H. Kerr Co. in 1911, by William D. Haywood and Frank Bone. The latter was formerly National Secretary of the SLP. This pamphlet, while not specifically endorsing the IWW, presented much of the latter's program, except that it called also for some measure of political action. The political line was the familiar de Leon conception of the political party winning the powers of government in an election, whereupon the industrial unions would really take over. The program declared that the labor union will become organized industrial society, and, under socialism, the government of the nation will be an industrial government, a shop government. This was de Leon's industrial republic all over again. The Haywood-Bone conception was called socialism in overalls. The pamphlet was full of the characteristic syndicalist de Leonist underestimation of the party, overestimation of the role of the industrial unions, misconceptions of the state, playing down of immediate demands, and indifference toward the urgent Negro question. An important distinction must be made, however. The de Leonite SLP, even in its best years of 1890 to 1900, was not a fighting, but a propaganda organization, and it organized and led no important strikes or other mass struggles. In contrast, the IWW and SP left wing fought the Gompers bureaucracy, agitated tirelessly for industrial unionism, were highly militant, and conducted some of the hardest fought strikes and free speech fights in American history. The broad left wing during this period, while it paid much lip service to Marxism, nevertheless carried out a revisionist line in a leftist sense. Had it studied the Marxist classics more carefully, had it but grasped the lessons of the great Communist Manifesto, not to mention the other Marxist classics and the innumerable writings of Marx, Engels, and Lenin on the American question, it could have avoided its gross theoretical errors. But this elementary task of putting the American left wing upon a truly Marxist path was to await the time when the writings of the great Lenin should come to the United States and the Communist Party be founded. 9. World War I. Social Democratic Betrayal, 1914 to 1918. The First World War was an inevitable consequence of the entry of capitalism into its imperialist stage. It was a ruthless clash among the big imperialist powers, each fighting for a greater share of the world, its resources and its markets. They began a battle royal for mutual subjugation or extermination. This struggle, which had been previously fought by economic and political means, was now to be decided on the field of battle. The war grew out of the very nature of the capitalist system. Capitalism, based on greed and force, could find no other way than war for resolving the fundamental conflicts among the big powers. The outbreak of the war expressed the working out of the law of the uneven development of capitalism, which was first stated by Lenin. That is, instead of developing at an even pace, the rate of growth and state of development of all the capitalist countries varied widely in tempo and extent. This spasmodic, jerky course of capitalist growth inevitably threw the great powers into violent collision with each other, to battle out a redivision of the world according to their changed economic and political relationships. After the turn of the century, Great Britain, the pioneer imperialist landgrabber, held more foreign territory than Germany, France, Russia, Italy, and the United States combined. But she had already lost her industrial leadership of the world. As Perla says, between 1899 and 1913 steel production in the United States and Germany increased threefold, while British steel production increased by little more than 50%, and British iron production declined. The former industrial leader of the world fell far behind its rivals. Consequently, the rival imperialists were impelled to redivide the world in accordance with the new power relationships, and World War I resulted. All the imperialist powers were war guilty. Germany aimed at seizing colonies from Great Britain and France, and at grabbing the Ukraine, Poland, and the Baltic provinces from Russia. Tsarist Russia fought for the dismemberment of Turkey and the acquisition of the Dardanelles. Britain strove to defeat its great rival, Germany, and also to take over Mesopotamia and Palestine. The French wanted the Saar, Alsace, and Lorraine from Germany, and the United States began to figure that with the weakening of its European rivals it could dominate the world. The alliance, primarily, of Great Britain, France, and Russia, eventually involving the United States, fought against the alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Turkey. All the great powers of the world were finally involved. The war, in which 65 million soldiers were engaged, started July 28, 1914, and lasted over 4 years, until November 11, 1918. It cost 10 million soldiers dead, 21 million wounded, innumerable civilian casualties, and it wasted $338 billion in wealth. In this typical capitalist wholesale butchery, the US British-French forces won the war and therewith the power to redivide the world to suit their imperialist greed. World War I was an explosion of basic imperialist tensions. It evidenced the fact that the world capitalist system had begun to sink into general crisis. The system's internal contradictions had now become so deep-seated and destructive that their working out began to undermine and destroy the capitalist system itself. World War I, by costing capitalism the loss of 1/6 of the world's territory, Russia, to socialism, did irreparable harm to the world's capitalist system. The Great Social Democratic Betrayal. The Marxists had long foreseen the coming of the First World War. Engels predicted it as early as 1892, and Lenin had repeatedly signalized its approach, its causes, and its imperialist character. Even the right-wing Social Democrats recognized the looming war clouds upon the world horizon. Consequently, after 1900 the question of the growing war danger was repeatedly considered at the Congresses of the Second International. These discussions climaxed at the Congress of Stuttgart, Germany, in 1907, in the adoption of an anti-war resolution containing the following key amendment, presented by Lenin, Rosa Luxemburg, and Martovy, for the Russian and Polish delegations. In case a war should, nevertheless, break out, the Socialists shall take measures to bring about its early termination and strive with all their power to use the economic and political crisis created by the war to arouse the masses politically and hasten the overthrow of capitalist class rule. This resolution was adopted at the Copenhagen Congress of 1910 and unanimously endorsed at the Conference of Bâle in 1912. American Delhi. Gates from the SP and SLP attended these gatherings. Meanwhile, the syndicalist leaders in France, Italy, and elsewhere were also militantly declaring that they would checkmate and defeat the threatened capitalist war by declaring a general strike against it. But when the war crisis actually came, the right-wing social democratic leaders promptly and in general ignored the unanimous resolutions against war, which they had adopted tongue-in-cheek. These people, as history has since so abundantly proved, were not socialists at all. At most, they were but believers in a fake, progressive capitalism, and their interests all dovetailed with those of the capitalists in their countries. So they shamelessly followed the latter into the war, blessing it as a defensive war, and making no resistance to it whatsoever. This was the logical climax to their whole reformist, opportunist line. The chief syndicalist leaders of Europe, despite all their previous fiery denunciations of war, mainly took the same chauvinist position. The German Social Democrats took the lead in this treason to the working class. 3 days after Germany entered the war, the Social Democratic fraction in the Reichstag voted the government war credits, with only the courageous Karl Liebknecht and a few others firmly standing by their anti-war pledges. Soon the conservative Social Democratic leaders all over Western Europe, the dominant socialist group in each country, followed the lead of the German Social Democrats, and lured and drove the masses into the slaughter on the pretext that they were fighting a defensive war. The leaders of the Second International proved to be traitors, betrayers of the proletariat, and servitors of the bourgeoisie. The Second International was dead. Actually, it broke up into separate social chauvinist parties which warred against each other. But the Russian Bolsheviks and small groups of left-wingers in various countries held fast. This, too, was the result of their entire history of Marxism and internationalism. The Russian Bolsheviks, who since 1903 had combated the right wing within the Social Democratic Labor Party of their country until they split and formed their own party in 1912, further developed their international policies in fighting against the war. They resolutely combated the war in Russia, and they took steps to unite the international anti-war forces. Besides eventually having revolutionary consequences in Russia, these anti-war activities led to the holding of the important wartime conferences in Zimmerwald, in September 1915, and in Kienthal, in 1916, both in Switzerland. At these conferences Lenin presented his famous slogan of transforming the imperialist war into civil war, for the establishment of socialism. Lenin was a great champion of peace, and his slogan would won history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, p. 164. Not only have ended the current slaughter in World War I, but would have prevented the even greater butchery of World War I. Lenin's orientation for peace was shown by a general appeal to all the warring countries to end World War I, which was made upon the establishment of the Soviet government. The conferences in Switzerland, while not adopting Lenin's slogan, nevertheless represented significant first steps toward uniting the anti-war forces and toward the eventual establishment of the Third, or Communist International, to take the place of the defunct Second International. The United States during the early years of the war. When the war broke out in Europe, the policy of the American bourgeoisie was to play neutral, to watch its imperialist rivals kill each other off, and to furnish them the necessary munitions with which to do the job, meanwhile making huge profits in blood money from the terrible slaughter. At the time the war began, the United States was in the midst of an economic crisis, but the flood of war orders soon had the industries humming busily again. Profits piled sky high, the monopolies expanded and multiplied, and before the war ended there were 20,000 new millionaires in the United States. From August 1914 to the end of 1918 the cost of living rose very rapidly, with wage rates dragging, and the workers were in a very militant strike mood. But the AFL leaders, obedient as ever to the basic interests of the capitalists, re-echoed the latter's neutrality slogans and damped down the efforts of the more and more impoverished workers to organize and strike. Most of the 4,924 strikes that took place during 1915 and 1916 were spontaneous, the work of the rank and file themselves. A notable struggle was the National 8-Hour Movement of the four railroad brotherhoods in 1916, which culminated in the passage of the Adamson Law, a substantial victory for the 350,000 workers involved. The IWW, unlike the AFL, carried out an active strike policy, with strikes, among others, of 8,000 oil workers in Bayonne, 15,000 iron miners in Minnesota, and 6,000 steel workers in Youngstown. The Socialist Party, in August 1914, adopted a resolution denouncing the senseless conflict, expressing its opposition to this and all other wars, waged upon any pretext whatsoever, and calling upon the United States, while carrying out a policy of strict neutrality, to use all its efforts to have the war ended as quickly as possible. It also demanded that the question of war should be referred to the people in a general referendum before the government could engage in hostilities. In December 1914, the party also proposed a whole program upon the basis of which the war should be settled. This pacifist program, which did not discriminate between just and unjust wars, was supported in practice by a general agitation against war and against the campaign to bring the United States into the struggle. The left wing especially led a strong fight against conscription. The American SP leadership promptly exonerated the Social Democrats in Europe of war guilt. In a statement on September 19, 1914, the National Executive Committee declared, "We do not presume to pass judgment upon the conduct of our brother parties in Europe. We realize that they are victims of the present vicious, industrial, political, and military system and that they did the best they could under the circumstances." Registered. The left wing of the SP, while not yet clearly differentiating itself from the official pacifist policy of the party, began to sharpen up its anti-war activity. In doing this, it utilized principally the columns of the International Socialist Review. On November 26, 1916, the Socialist Propaganda League of America, an SP left-wing organization, with headquarters in Boston, issued a manifesto sharply repudiating the war and condemning the treason of the right opportunists of the Second International. Lenin replied to this document, greeting its general line copyright and expressing the desire to combine our struggle with yours against the conciliators and for true internationalism. Registered. One of the outstanding events of the years just before the entry of the United States into the war was the arrest in San Francisco of Tom Mooney and Warren K. Billings. They were charged with responsibility for the bomb explosion in the Preparedness Day Parade on July 22, 1916, which killed 9 and wounded 40 persons. In the prevailing war hysteria, Mooney and Billings were shamefully framed up and sentenced to die, a sentence which later, under the pressure of the masses, including the revolutionary workers of Russia and other countries, was commuted to life imprisonment. The generation-long struggle of Mooney and Billings for freedom had begun. 132. History of the Communist Party. The United States joins the war. This country entered the war on April 6, 1917, 3 weeks after the world was startled by the bourgeois revolution in Russia on March 14. The reason why the United States went into the war was the fear on the part of the American bourgeoisie that the Anglo-French-Russian alliance would lose the struggle under the heavy blows of the German armies. The Wall Street monopolists, who could handle the declining British Empire, feared the rise of a far more powerful German Empire. The latter would have jeopardized their whole structure of foreign trade and investments. Hence, they plunged the United States into the war, eventually turning the tide against Germany. Just 5 months before this, Woodrow Wilson got himself re-elected president with the hypocritical slogan, "He kept us out of war." This slogan was a pledge that the United States would continue to stay out. But as soon as Wall Street saw its vital interests threatened, it cynically trampled upon all such pacifist demagoguery and flung the nation into the wholesale slaughter. In doing this, the capitalists were quite unconcerned that the American people had repeatedly showed that they were opposed to going into the war. Monopolist America, as Wilson declared, was now out to make the world safe for democracy. In order to circumvent the peace will of the people, big capital needed to mobilize the support of the labor leaders for the war. This proved to be only a small chore, however. The Gompers clique, obedient servants of capitalism, were ready and eager for the task. Gompers, in the early stages of the war, called himself a pacifist, but keeping step with the war plans of the capitalists, he grew more and more belligerent, until finally he became the most rabid of warmongers. As the entry of the United States into the war approached, Gompers called a General Trade Union Conference of the top officialdom on March 12, 1917. This conference declared that, should our country be drawn into the maelstrom of the European conflict, we offer our service and call upon our fellow workers devotedly and patriotically to give like service. This gave the government the green light, and 3 weeks later it rushed the country into the war. Gompers, however, faced a considerable opposition to his war treason in the ranks of organized labor. The United Mine Workers, Typographical Union, Ladies' Garment Workers, Western Federation of Miners and Journeyman Barbers refused to attend his pro-war conference. He sides, local unions, city central bodies, and state federations in many parts of the country were evidencing a strong anti-war spirit. But the Gompers machine, with the active help of the government, overrode this peace sentiment. One of the most effective means for doing this was the American Alliance for Labor and Democracy, organized on August 16, 1917, by the AF-L, jointly with pro-war renegades from the Socialist Party. The alliance, acting virtually as a government agency, held meetings in many parts of the country, peddling the war slogans of the imperialists. The Gompers machine promptly became part of American imperialism's war apparatus. Gompers himself was chairman of the Committee on Labor of the Advisory Commission of the Council of National Defense. Other officials occupied war posts of various kinds all over the country. Gompers remained a close co-worker of President Wilson all the way along, even at the Peace Conference of Versailles in 1919. The enemies of the workers hailed him as a great labor statesman. Gompers eventually wangled into the Versailles Treaty a watered-down version of his well-known dictum that the labor of a human being is not a commodity or article of commerce. This sentence was quoted from the Clayton Act of October 1914, which was supposed to, but did not, exempt organized labor from the Sherman antitrust law. Its deeper meaning, as Gompers stressed, was that, contrary to Marx, American workers were free. It was daily refuted by the fact that tens of millions of workers, acting under severe restraints, sold their labor power to their employers. The bosses, enjoying the reality of the wage system, which Gompers endorsed, were willing to allow the latter his demagogic assertion that labor power was not bought and sold in the United States. In addition to committing the labor movement generally to the war, the biggest service of the Gompers bureaucrats to the imperialists was to stifle the wartime efforts of the workers to organize and strike. Through the War Labor Board and National Defense Council, the AF-L and Railroad Brotherhood leaders gave up the right not only to strike, but even to organize the open shop basic industries. Lorwin says, organized labor relinquished its right to strike, and there was the understanding at Washington that the status quo in industrial relations should not be disturbed. Thenceforth, the Gompers' war policy was to smother strikes and to sabotage organizing campaigns. The workers, however, harassed by the rapidly rising living costs and having but little feeling of solidarity with the war, were in a very militant mood and much disposed to organize and strike. In 1917, the first war year, there were 4,233 strikes, or more than in any other previous year in American history. Consequently, despite its lead as ruinous policies, the AF-L grew by 650,000 members during 1917-18. Had it not 134. History of the communists been for the treacherous Gompers, no organizing, no strike agreement with the bosses and the government, the AF-L could readily have organized at least 10 million workers during the war and thus have accomplished the unionization of the basic and trustified industrics, a job, however, that had to await the arrival of the CIO, almost 2 decades later. The Socialists and the war. As the United States entered the war on April 6, the SP held its emergency convention in St. Louis to shape its policy to meet the situation. The sentiment in the party had been demonstrated by the adoption, by a vote of 11,041 to 782 in a national referendum, of a resolution proposing to expel any and all socialists holding public office who should vote money for the war. The party was slowly recovering from the blow of the 1912 split. Workers from the basic industries were again joining it. Membership increased from 79,374 in 1915 to 104,822 in the first 3 months of 1919. The St. Louis Convention was heavily anti-war. This was basically because of the tragic lessons of the socialist betrayal in Europe, the influences of the developing Russian Revolution, and the anti-war attitude of the new proletarian elements which had come into the party. Consequently, the outright pro-war socialists were swamped, and the Hillquit centrists also had to bend before the anti-war storm. At the convention 3 resolutions were presented on the war question. The majority resolution, submitted by Hillquit, branded the declaration of war by our government as a crime against the peoples of the United States and against the nations of the world, and declared the party's unalterable opposition to the war. It stated that the only struggle which would justify the workers in taking up arms is the great struggle of the working class of the world to free itself from economic exploitation and political oppression, and we particularly warn the workers against the snare and delusion of so-called defensive warfare. It proposed that the war be fought by continuous, active and public opposition to the war, through demonstrations, mass petitions and all other means within our power. Asterisk the second resolution, presented by Louis Boudin, varied but little from Hillquit's. The third resolution, by John Spargo, was openly pro-war, stating that, having failed to prevent the war, we can only recognize it as a fact and try to force upon the government through pressure of public opinion a constructive policy. The convention vote was as follows. For the Hillquit resolution, 140 votes, for Boudin's, 31 votes, and for Spargo's, 5 votes. Later on, in a national referendum, the majority resolution was endorsed by a vote of 21,000 to 350. The party's resolution was a product of a compromise between the center and the left. Ruthenberg was the outstanding leader of the left at the convention. He had also been a factor in the 1912 convention. Moreover, along with Wagenknecht, he had built a powerful party organization in Ohio, and he was increasingly active in fighting against the war. As secretary of the subcommittee which drafted the majority resolution, Ruthenberg was responsible for most of its fighting clauses. Hillquit's original draft was merely pacifist. Major weak spots in the resolution were that it did not more clearly distinguish between just and unjust wars, that it did not condemn the social chauvinists abroad, and that it did not provide a definite program for anti-war struggle. Following the convention, the pro-war elements, Simons, Benson, Stokes, Walling, Spargo, Hunter, Ghent, Russell, Gaylord, Frank and William Bone, et al., quit the party and joined the openly pro-war forces. Also many socialist trade union leaders, while formally remaining within the party, carried out the Gompers war line. Relatively few rank-and-file members were included in these defections. The centrist Hillquit leadership of the party, while adopting the anti-war resolution, did little to apply it. This lip service was necessary in order to cover up its betrayal in practice. Centrism was the dominant form of opportunist leadership in the SP in 1916-17, because the war was already 2 years old, revolutionary moods were rising in the ranks of the workers and soldiers in Europe, and this fighting spirit was reflected in the United States. The radicalism of centrism was designed to deceive these militant workers. The left elements, however, pushed the anti-war campaign vigorously, Debs, Ruthenberg, Wagenknecht, and others boldly speaking out against the war. Consequently, in the 1917 local elections the party polled high votes in New York, Chicago, Cleveland, and other centers, and its membership grew rapidly. Divergent attitudes toward the war created a growing friction between the right and left wings. 136. History of the Communist Party, the ILW, and the war. The IWW, from the outset, took a position of opposition to World War I and maintained it courageously. A couple of months after the war began, by convention resolution the organization condemned the war and refused participation in it. It declared that, we, as members of the Industrial Army, will refuse to fight for any purpose except for the realization of industrial freedom. This abstentionist attitude remained essentially the position of the IWW throughout the war. It was in sharp contradiction to the pro-war position of the French and other syndicalists. Paying but little attention to the political aspects of the war, the IWW devoted its main efforts to the prosecution of economic struggles and to building its own membership. Its operations concerned mostly agricultural workers, miners, and lumber workers. In carrying out this economic line, which was accompanied by anti-war agitation, the IWW encountered fierce opposition on the part of the government, the employers, the labor misleaders, and self-constituted vigilante gangs. The Agricultural Workers Organization, IWW, during the war years had an estimated 20,000 members. It conducted strikes of farm workers in many parts of the West, largely successful. One thing to which it paid special attention was halting the prevalent terrorizing and robbing of transient workers by railroad brakemen. It became so that a card in the AWO was good to ride freight trains almost anywhere throughout the West. In June 1916, the IWW conducted a strike on the Mesabi Iron Range in northern Minnesota. All the miners in the district came out, some 16,000. Several strikers were killed, the leaders were arrested, and the strike was broken. Later, however, the companies had to improve the conditions of the workers. In Everett, Washington, in November 1916, the IWW, engaged in a campaign of organizing lumber workers, came into head-on conflict with local vigilantes. 5-1. WW members and 2 vigilantes were killed. The militant IWW, however, pressed its work, and during 1917 it led strikes of some 50,000 lumber workers in Washington, Idaho, and Montana. Out of these fights eventually came the 8-hour day for the industry. In 1917, the IWW also conducted big strikes of copper miners, 24,000 in Arizona and 14,000 in Butte, Montana. The companies fought the strikes violently. In Bisbee, Arizona, 2,000 strikers were seized, transported far out into the desert, and left there with no food or water. This outrage provoked a national protest. In the hard-fought strike in Butte, on August 1, 1917, several gunmen kidnapped Frank H. Little from his hotel and hanged him from a railroad bridge on the outskirts of the city. Little, a member of the General Executive Board of the IWW, was laid up with a broken leg when the lynch gang seized him. At the end of the war the IWW's membership was variously estimated at up to 120,000. EBEALT, UL. The International Trade Union Educational League was formed in St. Louis, on January 17, 1915, at a conference of a dozen former members of the Syndicalist League from Chicago, Omaha, St. Louis, and Kansas City. Chicago was chosen as headquarters, and William Z. Foster was elected secretary. Its principal papers were the San Diego International, the Omaha Unionist, and the Chicago Labor News. The organization never really got established, however, basically because the left wing at the time, firmly wedded to the policy of dual unionism, had no use for the ITUEL's program of working within the old craft unions. A syndicalist organization, the ITUEL was anti-political, endorsed Industrial Union SM, and opposed the war. It held the opinion that the trade unions as such were essentially revolutionary, whether led by conservatives or revolutionaries. This was true, it argued, because they were class organizations, which followed a policy of securing all the concessions they could wring by force from the employers. In view of the ever-growing strength of the trade unions, the ITUEL falsely assumed that this policy would eventually culminate in the overthrow of the capitalist class by the economic power of the workers. Whereupon, the unions would take over the control of society. This syndicalism, of course, expressed a gross overestimation of the power of trade unionism and an equally great underestimation of the power of the capitalist state. It also underestimated the disruptive capacity of reactionary social democracy, and it did not give necessary weight to the need for a class-conscious ideology and a vanguard political party. By the spring of 1917, the ITUEL had disappeared as an organization, about all that was left of it being a loose group of a couple of dozen militants in Chicago and a scattering of active workers in other cities. Most of the Chicago group, however, were leaders in their local unions and also delegates to the Chicago Federation of Labor. There they constituted a very important influence. The former League members had fought against the war in Amer. 138. History of the Communist Party and participation in it, and had taken the general position that the outbreak of the war should have been countered by a revolutionary general strike. When the United States entered the war in April 1917, they took the position that, inasmuch as the revolution had been betrayed by the reactionary Social Democrats and syndicalists, the main task during the war was to organize the great unorganized masses into the trade unions. The trade unions, they held, were the all-important basic organizations that would one day emancipate the working class. The war situation, with the great demand for labor and the government's basic need for all possible production, presented an exceptionally favorable opportunity for such union-building work. This should be based on an active strike policy. Every other consideration in the war period was to be sacrificed to the central task of building the unions. Foster led this group. This, of course, was a highly opportunistic conception. While it did not involve actual support of the war, it nevertheless was an incorrect compromise. It was a sort of economism, an attempt to bypass the war and to focus the struggle upon immediate trade union questions. The very active unionizing and strike campaigns of the Chicago ITUEL group did, however, conflict directly with the no organizing, no strike policies of the pro-war Gompers machine. The Chicago group of militants were in a favorable position to get results in their aggressive unionizing campaigns. For several years they had been winning support in the Chicago Federation of Labor, and they had good working relations with the progressive Fitzpatrick Nockels leadership. It was largely because of the work of this militant group that the CF of L became the most progressive central labor union in the United States. The left forces, by their influence, made the CF of L the National Labor Center in the big fight to save Mooney and Billings. It became the leader in the National Labor Party movement from 1917 on. It hailed the Russian Revolution and demanded the recognition of the Soviet government. It fought the Gompers machine on many fronts, and it became identified with every progressive cause. Significant of the left-wing influence in all this radicalism was the fact that when later on, in 1923, the left-center alliance in Chicago was broken, the CF of L soon degenerated into a routine, conservative Gompers organization. The first important wartime unionizing work tackled by the Chicago militants was in the railroad industry. Through the Railroad Labor Council, set up by a number of AF of L and Brotherhood local unions which they led, the left forces organized some 25,000 workers locally into the railroad craft unions during 1916-17. This general movement, under the leadership of L. M. Hoover, a League member, finally culminated in the unofficial 1919 national strike of 200,000 railroad shopmen. The next and still bigger campaign of organization undertaken by the Chicago militants, former members of the ITUEL, was to organize the national meatpacking industry. For 13 years this great industry had remained almost completely without unions, and was considered by the AF of L to be impossible to organize. But the Chicago group pushed through the work successfully, on the basis of a federation of the dozen craft unions in the industry and an active organizing and strike policy. John Fitzpatrick was chairman of this national committee and William Z. Foster was its national organizing secretary. Jack Johnston, organizer for the CF of L, eventually became secretary of the Chicago Stockyards Council, with 55,000 members. Joseph Manley and various other left-wingers held key posts. The campaign began on July 11, 1917, and after striking the national industry once and taking another national strike vote, it ended successfully on March 1918, with an arbitration award by federal judge Altshuler, granting big wage increases, the 8-hour day, union recognition, and other improvements. At these arbitration hearings, the nation was amazed by the dramatic exposure of the horrifying wage and working conditions prevailing in the meatpacking industry. One of the greatest achievements in this packing house campaign was the organization of the Negro workers. They formed at least 20,000 of the 200,000 workers who were organized nationally. Their organization was of major importance and also unique in trade union history. They constituted the largest body of organized Negro workers anywhere in the world. Thus, the hopeless national packing industry, the despair of organized labor for many years, became organized. The whole labor movement was thrilled, and the prestige of the Chicago Federation of Labor and its left wing soared. The next big wartime organizing task which the Chicago ITUEL group set itself was the organization of the national steel industry, the toughest of all tasks confronting the labor movement. This campaign was begun on April 7, 1918, only a week after the Altshuler decision in the packing industry. The left-wingers presented the resolution on organization to the Chicago Federation of Labor, which endorsed it. Foster was elected delegate of the CF of L to the AF of L convention at St. Paul in June 1918, and he had the steel resolution adopted there. The organizing campaign began under a national organizing committee of representatives of 23 unions, with 3 million members. Gompers was chairman and Foster was organizing secretary. Later on, as the strike approached, Gompers got cold feet, resigned the chairmanship, and put John Fitzpatrick in his place. 140. History of the Communist Party. The campaign was marked with the characteristic Gompers sabotage, employer violence, and government repression. Nevertheless, the organizers managed to unite 250,000 steel workers in all the major steel centers of the country. The plan of the lefts had been to force a favorable settlement through a strike in wartime, but owing to lack of funds the campaign was slowed and the national strike of 367,000 steel workers did not come about until September 22, 1919, about 10 months after the war's end. The strike was crushed, after nearly 4 months, by a combination of sabotage by the Gompers machine and wholesale strikebreaking and violence by the employers and the government. Although the Great Strike was lost, the employers had to abolish the 12-hour day and 7-day week and to introduce many improvements in wages and working conditions. The 1919 strike, by proving that the steel industry, the greatest of all trustified, open shop, company unionized industries, could be organized, paved the way for the completion of this basic task 15 years later by the CIO. The Chicago group felt that all these big organizing successes constituted a brilliant justification of its long advocated policy of working within the old unions, but the SP left wing and IWW militants still remained fascinated by the dual union policy, which had been traditional for some 25 years past. Government terror against the left. The government, under the liberal Wilson, fearing the anti-war moods among the masses, immediately after pushing the country into the war, adopted a body of reactionary legislation directed at curbing the anti-war left. The first of these laws was the Espionage Act of June 15, 1917, a sort of grab-all law aimed at curbing a host of labor activities. This infamous law was eventually followed by the Trading with the Enemy Act, Conscription Act, and so on, as well as by dozens of anti-sedition and anti-syndicalism laws in the various cities and states. The sum total of all this legislation was to strip the American people of rights of free speech which at least the whites, if not the Negroes, had practiced ever since the founding of the Republic almost a century and a half before. Under these draconian laws the government, through Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, proceeded ruthlessly against the left wing of the labor movement. The IWW was the organization to suffer the heaviest blow. On September 5, 1917, simultaneous raids, with vigilante participation, were made by Department of Justice agents upon IWW headquarters all over the country. Private homes were broken into and records seized. Bill Haywood, General Secretary-Treasurer of the IWW, estimated that up to February 1918, 2,000 members were under arrest. The mass arrests covered all the members of the IWW. General Executive Board, secretaries of industrial unions, editors, and prominent local leaders. In Omaha, the whole convention of the Construction Workers Industrial Union, 164 delegates, was arrested. Substitute sets of leaders were also arrested nationally. Everywhere the IWWs were railroaded to jail for long sentences, charged with general obstruction of the war. The raids culminated in mass trials in Chicago, 165, Sacramento, 146, Wichita, 38, Tacoma, 7, Omaha, 27, Spokane, 28. In the Big Chicago trial, in April 1918, under the notorious Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis, 15-1. WW members got 20 years, 35 got 10 years, 33 got 5 years, and 12 got 1 year, and $2,300,000 in fines were levied against the convicted men. In Sacramento, of the IWWs on trial, 26 got 10 years each. Similar savage sentences were levied elsewhere. Many wartime raids and arrests were also directed against the Socialist Party. In September 1917, the national headquarters of the party was raided. Dozens of socialist papers, including the Appeal to Reason, International Socialist Review, The Socialist, New York Call on the Masses, were prosecuted, threatened with denial of second-class mailing privileges. Many of the papers died. Debs was arrested for a speech he made in Canton, Ohio, against war, on June 16, 1918, and was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. Scores of others, Charles E. Ruthenberg, Alfred Wagenknecht, Kate Richards O'Hare, J. O. Bentall, Scott Nearing, Rose Pastor Stokes, and many more, were jailed and given sentences ranging from 1 to 3 years. Molly Steimer, a young girl, got 15 years in jail for distributing leaflets against intervention in Russia. 1. The National Executive Committee of the SP was indicted through its officers, Victor Berger, Adolf Germer, J. Louis Engdahl, Irwin Street, John Tucker, and William Cruz, but they did not serve time. Besides the I-1, WW and SP cases, there were many other wartime arrests. Among them, Alexander Berkman and Emma Goldman were sentenced to 2 years for obstructing the draft. There were also various pacifists, conscientious objectors, and others jammed into the crowded jails. It has been estimated that 1,500 were sent to prison during the war. Debs went to jail on April 12, 1919, and got out on December 25, 1921. It was not until December 1923 that the last of the IWW war. Prisoners were set free under the pressure of a strong, united front mass campaign for their release. The wartime terrorism against the left was the first fruit of the imperialist war, to make the world safe for democracy. It was, however, only a foretaste of the still more bitter fruits that were to come, after victory was won and presumably democracy had been assured. The Great War, precipitated by the uneven development of world capitalism, made that unevenness even more pronounced. The United States, the real capitalist victor in the war, enormously expanded its industries during the war. It entered the war a debtor nation and emerged a great creditor nation, with $20 billion in outstanding loans. The dollar had defeated the pound and the mark, and the center of gravity had definitely shifted from Europe to the United States. Imperialist Wall Street was well on its march to world capitalist domination. World War I sowed the seeds for World War II. 10. The Russian Revolution, 1917 to 1919. The Great Russian Revolution of November 7, 1917, born of the deepening general crisis of world capitalism, was the first socialist breakthrough of the fortifications of the international capitalist system. The revolutionary masses of workers and peasants, led by the Bolshevik Party, which was headed by the great Lenin, smashed Tsarism capitalism in Russia and thereby dealt a mortal blow to the international capitalist system. World imperialism was broken at its weakest link. The revolutions of 1905 and of March 1917 had been but preliminary to the very basic Bolshevik Revolution of November 1917. A new era of world history was now ushered in, the era of proletarian and colonial revolutions and the decline of world capitalism. With revolutionary energy, the new Soviet government carried through the great tasks that the Kerensky provisional government could not and would not do. In order to consolidate the Soviet power, the old, bourgeois state machine had to be shattered and destroyed and a new, Soviet state machine set up in its place. Further, it was necessary to destroy the survivals of the division of society into estates and the regime of national oppression, to abolish the privileges of the church, to suppress the counter-revolutionary press of all kinds, legal and illegal, and to dissolve the bourgeois constituent assembly. Following on the nationalization of the land, all large-scale industry had also to be nationalized. And, lastly, the state of war had to be ended, for the war was hampering the consolidation of the Soviet power more than anything else. All these measures were carried out in a few months, from the end of 1917 to the middle of 1918. The Soviets withdrew from the war and called upon the world to make peace. The Russian Revolution sent a thrill of joy through the hearts of hundreds of millions of the exploited and oppressed all over the world. Its influence was decisive in the profound wave of revolution which swept Eastern and Central Europe upon the end of the war. Kings and emperors toppled as this revolutionary upsurge went through Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Balkans. The whole of European capitalism was shaken to its foundations. If the peoples of the world were inspired by the Russian Revolution, the capitalists of all countries were profoundly shocked by it. In their fright, they trembled at the threatened destruction of their whole system of exploitation and robbery. So they lost no time in taking drastic measures to try to checkmate and defeat the revolution. Immediately at the close of the war, the victorious Allied powers began to pour their troops into Soviet Russia and to stimulate and organize the domestic counter-revolutionists to fight the Soviet government. Great Britain, France, Japan, the United States, Germany, Poland, and Czechoslovakia all had a hand in this counter-revolutionary intervention. The consequence was a tremendous civil war. The revolutionary Soviet people, although harassed by economic breakdown, famine, blockade, and general exhaustion from the world imperialist war, rallied their forces, built up a powerful Red Army, and with unparalleled heroism, beat back all their foreign and domestic enemies. In this desperate struggle they battled through 1,000 valley forges. At one time by far the greater portion of the country was in the hands of the interventionists and their Russian counter-revolutionary allies. But the Red Army finally defeated them all, smashing Denikin, Kolchak, Yudenich, Wrangel, and the host of other Tsarist and foreign generals. Consequently, at the end of 1920 Great Britain, France, and Italy had to lift their blockade, and soon thereafter Japan was forced out of Siberia. The United States troops had to get out, too. The revolution had won a decisive victory in its life and death struggle. The basis for this immense victory were the indomitable revolutionary spirit of the Russian people, their all-out support of the Soviet Red Army, the invincible power of the Communist Party, and the brilliance of its great leader, Lenin. Not the smallest factor in winning the victory was the supporting spirit among the workers in many other countries, which prevented the respective capitalist governments from mobilizing their full strength against the embattled Soviet people. The United States government, dominated by reactionary monopoly capital, took a leading part in the counter-revolutionary intervention against Soviet Russia during 1918-20. The liberal President Wilson, without even asking any authorization whatever from Congress, arbitrarily sent armed American expeditions to Siberia and North Russia. The alleged purpose of the one to Siberia was to guard against the danger from large numbers of German and Austrian prisoners, freed by the revolution, whereas the stated purpose of the expedition to North Russia was to attack Germany from the rear. Vention was nothing but a brazen attempt to overthrow the young Soviet government and to restore capitalist reaction to power. The Siberian expedition of some 7,000 men, under General W. S. Graves, co-operated with the Russian reactionaries and the Japanese to overthrow the local Soviet in Vladivostok. President Wilson supported the Tsarist General Kolchak in his efforts to smash the Soviet government and to make himself dictator of Russia. The Siberian adventure came to an inglorious end when Kolchak's forces were wiped out by the Red Army. The adventure in North Russia, centering around Archangel, was carried out in conjunction with the British, French, and White Guard. Russians, about 5,000 American soldiers, under Colonel Stewart, made up this country's armed forces. The aim of the Allied expedition was the capture of Petrograd and the overthrow of the Soviet government. But the northern invaders were defeated and in danger of annihilation. On March Go, 1919, Company I of the 339 U.S. Infantry refused to obey orders to proceed to Archangel. The men yielded only after one of their number who had been arrested was released. This unrest was blamed upon Bolshevik propaganda. Fear of a general mutiny was expressed, and General March, Chief of Staff, pledged the withdrawal of the American forces by June, which was carried out. Lenin roundly condemned this reactionary United States intervention, declaring that the British and Americans are acting as hangmen and gendarmes of Russian freedom, in the same sense in which the role was played under the Russian hangman, Nicholas I. This was only the first of a generation-long series of United States aggressions against Soviet Russia, including also economic blockade and diplomatic boycott, all of which were defeated by the unconquerable revolutionary Russian people. The United States refused even to recognize the USSR diplomatically until 1933, in Roosevelt's day. This bitter anti-Soviet hatred on the part of the ruling monopolists of the United States, implacable and never-ending, has finally culminated in Washington's present attempt to organize an all-out capitalist war against the USSR. The Social Democrats betray the revolution. Inspired by the Russian Revolution and horrified by the butcheries of World War I, the world's workers were swept by a great wave of revolutionary spirit, especially in Europe. Given proper leadership, the latter were ready to follow the example of the Russian workers. They were ripe for socialist revolution. But the right-wing leaders of the big European social democratic parties, strongly entrenched in all the organizations of the working class, had quite different ideas. To them the proletarian revolution, both in Russia and in their own countries, was a terrible nightmare, no less so than to the employers. It went violently counter to their whole outlook and program, which was to patch up capitalism here and there with minor reforms. They were committed, in reality, to the continuation of the capitalist system, and the very last thing they wanted was to see this system overthrown and a real socialist system substituted. Therefore, just as these elements had rushed to the support of their respective capitalist classes during World War I, so now they hurried to the defense of the capitalist system itself, threatened as it was with revolution. Joining forces with the capitalists, these pseudo-socialists proceeded to attack with fire and sword the entire revolutionary movement among the proletarian masses in all its manifestations, both at home and in Russia. The dominant and traitorous European right-wing leaders were typified by such figures as Legion, Noske, and Schiedmann in Germany, Henderson, Hindman, and MacDonald in England, Guesde and Thomas in France. Another group of social democratic leaders, the centrists, were typified by Kautsky, Hilferding, Bauer, Longwet, Fenner-Brockway, Hilquet, and Ledebour. The latter group was long on revolutionary phrases and short on revolutionary struggle. Lenin characterized Kautsky as, in words everything, in deeds nothing. The substance of the centrists' policy was to give lip service to the revolution while fighting against it in fact. The general effect of this policy was to paralyze the action of the revolutionary workers, while the right forces, in open alliance with the capitalists, virtually cut the revolution to pieces. It was these centrist elements who set up so-called left socialist parties to block the communist parties in various countries. In February 1921, in Vienna, they formed the International Working Union of Socialist Parties, nicknamed the EWO and a Half International, as a counterweight to the Communist International. After the depth of the revolutionary crisis in Central Europe had passed, the centrists and their phony international went back where they belonged politically, into the Second International. The apparently divergent policies of the right-wing leaders and the centrists were, in fact, only a division of labor, the basic aim of which was to defeat the revolution in Central and Western Europe. This they accomplished together, working hand in hand with the capitalist generals and politicians. They shot down the revolution in Germany, Hungary, Austria, and Italy, and only the strong fist of the Red Army prevented them from doing the same thing in Soviet Russia. The right and centrist, social democratic leaders saved capitalism in Middle Europe, and thereby also in Western Europe. Upon the heads of these betrayers of socialism, therefore, rests the responsibility for all the evils that have since followed, the rise of fascism, World War II, and now the threat of another great world conflagration. Impact of the revolution upon the American labor movement. In the United States, as in other countries, a wave of fighting spirit was generated among the masses by the advent of the Great Russian Revolution, but, unlike Eastern Europe, it did not reach the intensity of a tornado. At last the workers had succeeded in smashing their way through the fortifications of the hated capitalist system and had opened up the way to socialism. Even the more conservative categories of workers realized that a great blow had been struck for freedom. Crowded meetings of workers in American cities, hungry for every scrap of information about the First Workers' Republic, made the rafters ring with applause at every mention of the Bolsheviks and their great leader, Lenin. Debs, with his genius for revolutionary expression of rank and file spirit, declared, "From the crown of my head to the soles of my feet I am a Bolshevik, and I am proud of it. The day of the people has come." The Seattle longshoremen, in the spirit of the period, struck against loading munitions to be used against Soviet Russia. The broad masses of the American proletariat distinctly felt that the great victory in Russia was also their victory. This was especially the case among the huge armies of immigrant workers. But the opportunist leaders of the American social democracy, like their kind in Europe, took an altogether different attitude toward the Russian Revolution. The AFL top leaders, for example, an undeveloped brand of social democrats who, because of the ideological undevelopment of the American working class, do not need to make demagogic use of socialist slogans, condemned the revolution from the 148. History of the Communist Party outset. Their instinct, as labor tools of the capitalists, was as unerring in their hatred of living socialism as that of the big monopolists themselves. The 1919 convention of the AFL refused its endorsement of the Soviet government of Russia, and subsequent conventions, becoming bolder in their reaction, attacked the Soviets with unlimited violence and slander. From the earliest period right down to the most recent days, the big bureaucrats of the AFL have been outstanding and relentless instigators of every capitalist assault against the Soviet Union. The leaders of the Socialist Party, at the outset, were more circumspect. They were mostly centrists of the Hilquet brand, the bulk of the extreme right-wing leaders having quit the party after their failure to win it for a pro-war policy. The centrist opportunists, who also in their hearts deeply hated the Soviet government and considered it the repudiation of all their political plans and programs, adopted a policy of maneuvering regarding it, against the pressure of the militant rank and file of the party. Consequently, they weakly hailed the revolution, and in their 1919 convention, tongue-in-cheek, pledged our support to the revolutionary workers of Russia in the maintenance of their Soviet government. They also, pushed on by the rank and file, lodged a formal protest against the armed intervention of the United States and other capitalist powers in Soviet Russia. But when, as the sequel showed, the hypocrisy of these pretenses was unmasked, Hilquet and his co-leaders became no less violent in their opposition to the Soviet Union than were their political kin, the reactionary leaders of the AFL. Hilquet later pronounced the Soviet government the greatest disaster and calamity that has ever occurred to the socialist movement. The left wing tirelessly challenged the treacherous attitude of the Hilquet leadership toward the Russian Revolution, bringing to the masses, as best it could, the lessons of this tremendous political forward leap of the world's working class. And the Communist Party, born from the left wing of the Socialist Party, throughout its 32 years of life, has never flagged in its efforts to have the masses of workers understand the constructive meaning of this gigantic political development. The teachings of Marxism-Leninism. The Russian Revolution, and the long revolutionary struggle preceding it, resulted in the formulation of tremendous contributions to the body of Marxist social science. These were expressed in the reality of the Great Revolution itself and, inseparably, in the brilliant scientific writings of Lenin. The sum and substance of this whole theoretical development was to raise Marxism to the level of Marxism-Leninism. This, in a scientific sense, is the greatest of all the contributions of the Russian Revolution to world humanity. Leninism, says Stalin, is the Marxism of the era of imperialism and of the proletarian revolution. There are two major aspects to the theoretical work of Lenin. First, Lenin re-established the principles of Marxism, as already stated by Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto and their other works. These principles the right-wing theoreticians of the Second International had been busily tearing down and burying for the previous half-century. Second, Lenin further greatly developed Marxism, adding to it the basic lessons to be learned from the present period of imperialism and proletarian revolution. His work summed up to a complete theory of the socialist revolution. In the first aspect of Lenin's work, namely, the freeing of Marxism from opportunist revisionism, Lenin restated Marx's basic proposition that the present state is a repressive instrument of capitalism, the executive committee of the capitalist class, thereby theoretically destroying the current social democratic revisionist conception that the modern state under capitalism is a sort of people's state, without specific capitalist class domination. Lenin also proved the correctness, under modern conditions, of Marx's fundamental contention that the capitalist state, because of ruling class violent resistance to all democratic advance, would have to be abolished before socialism could be established. He declared that all the right-wing social democratic chatter about capitalism being gradually transformed step by step into socialism was opportunism. At the same time, Lenin showed the growing over of the bourgeois democratic revolution into the socialist revolution. Lenin, too, demonstrated irrefutably the fundamental correctness of Marx's conception of the dictatorship of the proletariat being the state form of the workers' rule under socialism, and he shattered all revisionist nonsense about socialism, or what the opportunists miscall socialism, being only a continuation, in a more advanced form, of bourgeois democracy. Lenin also brilliantly revalidated the great Marxist principle of the class struggle, as against the mess of class collaborationism, which actually means working-class subordination to capitalist class domination, into which the revisionist theoreticians of the Second International had bogged down the socialist movement. Finally, to mention no more of Lenin's tremendous rebuttressing of Marxism, he restated Marx's Funda. 150. History of the communist mentals of dialectical materialism, in opposition to the welter of bourgeois idealism and eclecticism which the degenerate social democratic theoreticians of the Second International had absorbed from their bourgeois masters. In the second major aspect of Lenin's theoretical accomplishments, namely, the development of Marxism to encompass the many problems of modern monopoly capitalism and proletarian revolution, Lenin performed a prodigious amount of pioneering theoretical work. Here we can give only the barest outline of his immense contributions in this respect. Lenin performed the basic task of analyzing capitalist imperialism, dissecting the whole structure of modern monopoly capitalism, and demonstrating that it is moribund capitalism, the final stage of the capitalist system. In doing this work, Lenin laid bare the basic causes of modern war. This general analysis he further strengthened by his profound discovery of the law of the uneven development of capitalism. The law which explains how and why the capitalist nations, instead of all developing at an even pace, grow at widely varying tempos, with the result that they periodically readjust by war their changing political relationships. Lenin also successfully challenged the bigwigs of the Second International, who held that socialism must come first in the most industrialized countries and, to be successful, must also occur in several of them at once. He proved that socialism, on the contrary, could be established in one country alone, specifically in backward, predominantly agricultural Russia. Stalin, later on, was also to make brilliant contributions on this key question. Lenin, while pointing out the ingrained warlike character of imperialism, also stressed both the necessity and the possibility of the peaceful coexistence of capitalist and socialist states in the world. Lenin, along with Stalin, developed the theory of colonial and national liberation revolution. He likewise demonstrated the basic need for cooperation between the colonial peoples and the revolutionary proletariat of the imperialist countries. Repudiating the entire body of social democratic revisionist theory, Lenin also showed the revolutionary potentialities of the peasantry in alliance with and under the general leadership of the proletariat. Lenin, who was as great a strategist and tactician as he was a theoretician, developed the role of partial demands, of trade unionism, and of parliamentarism, thus solving many difficult problems of methods and weapons in the general fight of the working class for socialism. Lenin, throughout his entire work, thoroughly unmasked the opportunist Social Democrats, showing them to be wedded to the capitalist system, and exposing the economic and political reasons why this was so. To cap his immense theoretical achievements, Lenin was also the architect and chief organizer of the Great Russian Communist Party, which led the Russian people in their historic victory over capitalism. Lenin called this a party of a new type. It is incomparably the most highly developed political organization in the history of mankind. The Communist Party is composed of the best, most advanced elements of the working class, peasantry, and intellectuals. It is highly disciplined, yet it practices a profound democracy. It employs a regenerating self-criticism, learning from its own mistakes, which invigorates it in every phase and stage of its work. Its membership is inspired by the highest qualities of courage, devotion to the Soviet people's interests, and loyalty to the great cause of socialism. This great party, the nightmare of capitalists and their social democratic henchmen all over the world, is an imperishable monument to Lenin's theoretical skill and organizing ability, and also to the profound revolutionary spirit of the Soviet people. Lenin, like Marx, incorporated his theoretical work in many powerful books. And Lenin, again like Marx, also found the greatest justification of his writings, not only in their strong argumentation, but especially in the supreme test of experience in life itself. Lenin not only worked out revolutionary theories, but he also stood at the head of the masses of the Russian people in carrying through, in line with these theories, the greatest revolution in all of human history. His closest co-worker in this tremendous movement was Stalin. Lenin's theories and Marx's are now being profoundly justified by the present whole course of world political development, by the rapid decline of capitalism and rapid rise of socialism. Marxism-Leninism and the American Marxists. Marxism-Leninism is universal in its application. It is as naturally international as are all other branches of science. Its principles and policies apply to all countries, in all stages of capitalist or socialist development. But, following the dictum of Engels, and as every communist theoretician has pointed out time and again, Marxism-Leninism is not a dogma, but a guide to action. It is not to be applied as a blueprint in every situation, as a ready-made panacea. The value of Marxism-Leninism can be realized in a given country only if its principles and policies are flexibly adapted to the specific situation prevailing in that country. As Lenin put it in 1918, the revolution proceeds with a different tempo and in different forms in different countries, and it cannot be otherwise. J. 152. History. Marxism-Leninism made its impact upon the American left socialist movement not only by means of the practical example of the Russian Revolution and Lenin's major writings, but also by direct counsel from Lenin himself. Lenin knew the American situation profoundly and was deeply interested in it. He wrote a basic work on American agriculture, and twice he sent major political letters directly to the American working class, once, in 1916, in answer to a manifesto of the Socialist Propaganda League, and the second time in 1918, in his famous letter to American workers. Also, during the early years of the Communist International, Lenin often spoke about the American question. The initial influence of Marxism-Leninism on American Marxist thinking was tremendous. Lenin provided the basic answers to many complicated problems of theory and practice which for decades past had confused and crippled the American socialist movement. This clarification, besides acting with crushing effect upon the right-wing sophistries, also tended to liquidate the traditional sectarian errors of the left wing. Lenin exposed the Leonite theories, syndicalist and sectarian, which had dominated and plagued the left wing ever since the death of Engels almost a quarter of a century earlier. Lenin provided a solid theoretical basis for the left's fight against Gompersism in the trade unions, and he also refuted the pseudo-socialist pretenses of all sections of right-wing social democracy, including its Bernsteinian and Kautskian varieties. This had a clarifying and strengthening effect upon the American Marxist movement. Highly important from the American standpoint was Lenin's scientific analysis of imperialism. With powerful emphasis, Lenin pointed out the qualitative differences that develop within the whole structure of capitalism with the growth of monopoly. Previously, without clearly differentiating itself from the right wing on this question, the left wing had tended to consider the growth of monopoly as merely a quantitative development of capitalism, and its expansionism, imperialism, as simply a secondary policy manifestation, instead of a basic expression of monopoly capitalism. This error led to a profound underestimation of the aggressive character, reactionary aims, and war-making potentialities of imperialism. Lenin cleared up all this confusion. Lenin also made clear the road of all-out political mass struggle to socialism. In so doing, he annihilated for Americans the prevalent Leonite, syndicalist ideas that the workers would win their way to power by locking out the capitalists, or by means simply of a general strike, and other kindred illusions. He also smashed the syndicalist conception, previously held almost unanimously by all sections of the American left wing, to the effect that after the workers had secured political power the party would dissolve itself and the unions would take over the management both of the industries and of society as a whole. Lenin, with the reality of the Russian Revolution to back up his words, clearly outlined the Soviet form of the dictatorship of the proletariat, pointed out that it is incomparably more democratic than the bourgeois dictatorship, and stressed the decisively leading role of the party in every stage of the struggle, both before and during the existence of socialism. Lenin also, in his masterly analysis of the national question, with the able cooperation of Stalin, laid the basis for a fundamental understanding of the Negro question in the United States, a problem that had baffled left-wing thinking up to that time. With his historic doctrine that, without a revolutionary theory there can be no revolutionary movement, Lenin struck hard, too, at the traditional American tendency to minimize theory. Among his many other contributions to the American revolutionary movement, Lenin clarified the question of the role of the farmers, which had always been a weak spot in SLP and SP policy, especially after the advent of de Leon. Lenin stressed the vital necessity of labor cooperating with the oppressed and exploited strata of these toilers, and he indicated the basic conditions under which such cooperation, with working-class leadership, should be carried out. Lenin, also, with his strong anti-sectarian position and his supreme genius for mobilizing all the potential strength of the anti-capitalist forces, laid the basis for a clarification of the question of the Labor Party. Smashing through the crippling de Leonite policy of non-participation in the broad, elemental mass movements of struggle, Lenin categorically, like Engels long before him, supported participation in such movements. Lenin likewise clarified the knotty question of partial political demands, which had also been a bone of contention in left-wing ranks for many years, especially under de Leon's intellectual tutelage. Indeed, Lenin had made this question quite clear in Russian practice, long before the Bolshevik Revolution. He showed that partial demands are an integral part of the workers' whole struggle. And Stalin, in his Foundations of Leninism, points out that reforms are byproducts of revolutionary struggle and reforms can and must be used in the fight for socialism. Lenin also clarified American Marxists on the question of religion. The Socialist Party, from its inception, had a confusion of policy on the matter, ranging from a cultivation of petty bourgeois, Christian socialism, to the placing of God-killing as the main task of the party. Leary, reiterating Marx's statement that religion is the opium of the people, stressed its class role in the exploitation of the workers and declared, "We demand that religion be regarded as a private matter so far as the state is concerned, but under no circumstances can we regard it as a private matter in our own party." Lenin insisted, on the one hand, upon the complete separation of church and state, and on the other, on an educational campaign by the party. However, the propaganda of atheism by the social democracy must be subordinated to a more basic task: the development of the class struggle of the exploited masses against the exploiters. The party should not write atheism into its program. It should, however, freely admit religious-minded workers to membership and then educate them to a scientific outlook on life. The writings of Lenin, the master party builder, clarified the American left-wing movement about the structure, practice, and role of the Communist Party. In this respect, he also made crystal clear many problems which had worried and handicapped the left for many years. Lenin's basic teachings on the party were especially needed in the United States, because of the long prevalence of syndicalist and semi-syndicalist ideas, the heart of which was a belittlement of the party and an underestimation of political action. To all these great contributions of Lenin to the American movement must be added at least another. It was Lenin, above all others, who finally knocked on the head the chronic American sectarian disease, the dual union illusion. As we have seen earlier, ever since the days of Debs' American Railway Union in 1894 and de Leon's Socialist Trades and Labor Alliance in 1895, American left-wingers had been obsessed with the idea that the way to revolutionize the labor movement was to withdraw from the conservative trade unions and to organize independent, theoretically perfect industrial unions. The general effect of this policy had been to leave the Gompers machine in virtually unchallenged control of the basic mass economic organizations of the working class and to waste the strength of the dynamic left-wing fighting trade unionists in innumerable utopian industrial union projects. Lenin had encountered the problem of such abstention from the unions in Russia in 1908, on the part of the Otzevists, a group among the Bolsheviks. These elements, among other wrong tendencies, refused to work in the trade unions and other legally existing societies. Lenin, with his keen ability to go straight to the heart of a problem, and thus with a penetrating analysis to settle it once and for all, sailed into the Otzevists and destroyed their position completely. Lenin dealt again and crushingly with this particular sectarian abstentionist tendency. Shortly after the beginning of the Russian Revolution, when ultra-lefts, in Germany, Holland, England, and other European countries, in the exuberance of their revolutionary spirit, had no patience for work in the old trade unions, but sought shortcuts by setting up new revolutionary labor organizations. Lenin sharply denounced this practice as a serious form of sectarianism. He declared that, to refuse to work within reactionary trade unions means leaving the insufficiently developed or backward working masses under the influence of reactionary leaders, agents of the bourgeoisie, labor aristocrats, or bourgeoisified workers. This criticism applied with triple force to the United States, where the dual union fallacy had reigned almost unchallengeable in left circles for many years, thereby doing incalculable damage to the revolutionary movement. Lenin, in fighting for a correct political line, fought on two fronts. That is, he combated both the right danger and all forms of pseudo-leftism. This two-front fight was particularly necessary in the United States, with its ingrained historical right weakness of American exceptionalism and its long affliction of left sectarianism. The long-continued sectarianism of the left wing was basically an immature political reaction against the extreme opportunism of the SP and AFL leaders, which was bred of the especially corrupting influences of American political life. The left's dual unionism, anti-Labor Party, anti-farmer, anti-immediate demands, anti-parliamentary, and other ultra-revolutionary policies and attitudes were shortcut methods aimed to create powerful trade unions, a militant workers' party, and a mass socialist ideology. A historical influence, too, producing left sectarianism was the pressure of the vast body of foreign-born workers, who were as yet little integrated into American economic, political, and social life. Important also in this general respect was the fact that the American Marxist movement, in the imperialist epoch, had produced no outstanding Marxist theoretician, capable of immediately and basically solving the many complex problems faced by the working class. During many years, from the 18 goes on, the great Lenin was developing Marxism into Marxism-Leninism and building the core of the eventual powerful Bolshevik Party. At this time, the American Socialists, in an extremely difficult objective situation, were being gravely hindered in their development by the powerful but revisionist influence of the ultra-left sectarian and semi-syndicalist theoretician, de Leon. The sudden impact of Lenin's profound and comprehensive writings, supported as they were by the tremendous reality of the Russian Revolution, revolutionized the thinking of the Marxist forces in the United 156. History of the Communist Party States. The left moved rapidly toward a position of scientific communism. As Alexander Bittelman put it, the formative period in the history of our party appears as a development from left socialism to communism. The essence of this development consisted in this, that the left wing of the Socialist Party, 1918-1919, was gradually freeing itself from vacillation between reformism and ultra-left radicalism by means of an ever closer approach to the positions of Marxism-Leninism. Manifestly, Marxism-Leninism applied completely to the United States, but not as a blueprint. For this country is no exception. It is flesh and blood of the world capitalist system and is subject to that system's laws of growth and decline. But to adapt this tremendous body of scientific Marxist-Leninist principles to the specific conditions prevailing in the United States, that is, for the strengthening of every phase of the American workers' struggle for a better life, was a task of very large proportions. And as the sequel showed, many mistakes were to be made in this adaptation. Long-continued modes of incorrect thinking and of sectarian policies were not be overcome in a day. To build a mature communist party in any capitalist land is a very difficult political task, but most of all, in the United States, the stronghold of world capitalism. 11. Vey split in the Socialist Party, 1919. The split in the Socialist Party, which gave birth to the Communist Party, came to a head in the fall of 1919. It had its origin in the long struggle between the right and left which had gone on in the party, with constantly greater intensity, ever since the foundation of the organization in 1901. Historically, this struggle had turned around many issues, covering practically every phase of the party's program, its everyday activities, and its composition. It was the struggle of the militant proletarian left of the party, striving to make the Socialist Party into the fighting party of the working class, against the opportunist right which wanted to make it into a party of petty bourgeois reforms. That these two incompatible groups should eventually find themselves in separate parties was inevitable. The long internal struggle. In the present history we have already briefly reviewed some of the outstanding features of this long and ever-growing struggle within the SP. Among these were the persistent fights against the control of the party by petty bourgeois opportunists, the many years' battle against burghers, Milwaukee socialism, the struggle against pro-Gompersism in the party leadership, the persistent effort of the left to make the socialists active workers in strikes, labor defense cases, and other working-class battles, the struggle against white chauvinism and the oppression of the Negro people. The fight for the organization of the unorganized into trade unions, the endless battle over industrial unionism, the struggle for a strong anti-war policy, and the attempt to give the party a sound position on the Russian Revolution. It was a continuous battle against an insolent and aggressive Bernsteinism, a corrupt Gompersism, and a tricky Kautskyism, by a militant left wing working to create a fighting Marxist policy and party. Toward the end of World War I, the dominant party leadership had crystallized into two opportunist groups. 1. The extreme right, the outright Bernsteinians, although weakened by the right-wing split on the war, were typified by Berger, Kahn, Germer, Hayes, Van Leer, Stitt, Wilson, Harriman, and the like. The other group, the centrists, Kautskians, who were long on revolutionary phrases and short on revolutionary deeds, was typified by Hillquit, O'Neill, and Lee. As the struggle against the left developed, these two groups tended to merge into one general right wing, resolved at all costs to prevent the party from becoming a fighting socialist organization. The constant internal struggle led, through the years, as we have seen, to a number of heavy political organizational collisions between the right and the left. During the earlier days of the party there were sharp local struggles in many cities and states, Texas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, and especially Washington in 1909. Then came the big national battle at the 1912 convention in Indianapolis over the moot question of the party's rejection of the use of sabotage in the class struggle. Next, there followed the struggle at the 1917 St. Louis Emergency Convention and afterward, with the party's anti-war policy as the main bone of contention. And finally, there came the decisive 1919 Chicago Convention, when the whole life and line of the party were at stake. During this long struggle the left wing, although not able to control the party, had been growing in political strength and maturity. While still largely a prey to left sectarianism, it had nevertheless clarified itself on many questions. It was also developing organizationally. Its growing consolidation as a definite national force was seen in its strong grouping in pre-war days around the International Socialist Review. And, after the Review had been destroyed during the war, around the Socialist Propaganda League, which had been launched in Boston in November 1916, with S. J. Rutgers, who later returned to his homeland, Holland, as its leader. Finally, in Chicago, in September 1919, the left wing could and did establish its own independent political organization. This was an historical political necessity. The American Communist movement, fundamentally the product of a long evolution in the intense class struggle of the United States, had at last reached its natural goal by becoming an independent party. Pata Co. The immediate causes of the 1919 split. Various powerful political forces combined to bring about the split in the Socialist Party at the precise time it occurred. Fundamentally, these were products of World War I and the Russian Revolution. The United States, under its own specific conditions, felt the terrific shock of these basic events which were undermining the whole structure of world capitalism. Among the manifestations of this shock were the breakup of the Socialist Party and the birth of the Communist Party. A major immediate factor leading to the split within the party was the acute discontent among the rank and file at the way the opportunist party leadership had met the issue of the war. This was directed not only at the seceding pro-war leaders of the right, but also at the Hillquit group. There had been great enthusiasm after the St. Louis Convention, with its militant anti-war resolution, even the left wing being more or less taken in by Hillquit's anti-war demagogy. But soon thereafter disillusionment set in among the lefts, because many of the party leaders who had voted for the St. Louis resolution either failed to back it up in practice or came out in open support of the war. This course deeply outraged the proletarian membership, who ardently wanted the party to conduct a militant struggle against the imperialist war. Added to this rank and file discontent was an even greater resentment of the left-minded membership at the compromising manner in which the right-centrist Hillquit leadership handled the central question of the Russian Revolution. The militant membership of the party rightly looked upon the revolution as a supreme socialist triumph of the Russian working class, and they were determined to give it all the support and protection they could against the armed intervention and other attacks being made upon it by the capitalists of the United States. Consequently, the proletarian members of the party were not slow to understand that the Hillquit leaders of the party, with their weasel-worded, opportunistic endorsements of the Soviet government and their feeble protests against American intervention in Soviet Russia, were in reality enemies of the Russian Revolution. Additional fuel was added to the fire of party discord by the specific controversy over the question of the international affiliation of the party. This began to take shape during the war in connection with the wartime conferences in Zimmerwald and Kienthal, with the left wing pressing for active support of Lenin's fight for a sound international working-class policy. It became even more acute when in Moscow, under Lenin's direct leadership, on March 2–6, 1919, 19 left-wing groups and parties established the Third, or Communist, International. This was an indispensable development, growing out of the whole international situation, with the Second International broken down by the war treason of its leaders and the revolutionary workers of Europe on the march, demanding a new international organization. Errol, the left wing of the American Socialist Party, insisted that the party affiliate to the Communist International. But again the slippery Hillquit leadership, while speaking softly about the new organization, took an active initiative in trying to put the shattered Second International back on its feet. The latter elected delegates to the proposed Stockholm Conference of 1917, which never assembled, and they also supported the Bern Conference of September 1918, both of which were designed to disinter the dead Second International. These actions caused deep resentment in the Socialist Party of the United States. Still another factor intensifying the inter-party tension was the urgent need to develop a fighting program to support the current big struggles of the workers and to counter the post-war offensive of the employers. This was the time of the Seattle General Strike, January 1919, of the Winnipeg General Strike, April 1919, and of the Great Steel Strike, September 1919. Many other strikes were looming on the horizon. On all sides, too, the employers were obviously preparing for an aggressive anti-labor drive. The opportunist Hillquit leadership, to the deep discontent of the rank and file, was quite incapable of developing a program of militant action which would place the party in the vanguard of the tremendous class struggles which were then in the process of taking place. The relationship of the party forces. The left wing of the party was in a strong position in the growing internal fight. Its supporters had been basically educated in the fight against the war, and they were also profoundly inspired by the Great Russian Revolution. Most important in strengthening the ideology of the left wing during this critical situation was the initial publication in the United States during 1918 and 1919 of such fundamental documents of Lenin's as A Letter to American Workers, The Soviets at Work, State and Revolution, and Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. The left clearly had behind it a majority of the party membership. It drew its strength from all sections of the party, but its main strongholds were in New York, Ohio, Michigan, Illinois, and Massachusetts, and especially in the language federations. Of these organizations, the Russian Socialist Federation, with about 8,000 members, was the largest and most militant. The party membership had gone up from 80,379 in 1917 to 104,822 in the first months of 1919, and most of these new members, workers who had been recruited by the federations, were definitely left in their thinking. Regarding the party press, the right-wing leadership eventually managed to hang on to control of the New York Call and most of the other English-speaking organs. The non-English press, however, with the notable exception of the Jewish Daily Forward, almost solidly supported the left wing. During the struggle, the left wing created several new English-language papers, the most important of which were the Class Struggle, 1917, and the Communist, 1919, in New York, the Revolutionary Age, 1918, in Boston, the Proletarian, 1918, and the Communist, 1919, in Chicago, and the Socialist News in Cleveland. The Revolutionary Age served as the central organ of the SP left-wing movement. During the previous few years, the left wing had also been building up many new leaders. Outstanding among these were Charles E. Ruthenberg of Cleveland and John Reed of New York. These new leaders could be depended upon to fight for a sound program. While the old left-wing leader, Debs, spoke militantly against the war and for the Russian Revolution and also supported other policies of the left, he nevertheless refused to carry on the indispensable struggle against the right-wing opportunists who held the leading posts in the party. Haywood, outside of the party, belonged to the IWW. The right wing in the party, in contrast to the left, was in a very difficult situation. It was definitely in the minority, and besides, it had lost many of its ablest writers and speakers through the wartime defection of these pro-war elements. But what the rights lacked in numbers and ability they hoped to make up in a ruthless use of their key posts in the party. As reactionaries always do in such situations, they decided to defeat the democratic will of the membership by violence and to hold on to the party leadership at all costs. To achieve their own program, the left wing sought, as the fight grew, to function through the democratic workings of the party. But the Hillquit-Berger leadership, with their desperate policies, would have none of party democracy under these conditions. The Revolutionary Age expressed the situation thus. The slogan of the moderates is, "Split the party for moderate socialism." The slogan of the left wing is, "Conquer the party for revolutionary socialism," for the Communist International. Along these lines the fight was conducted. In view of the right wing's complete suppression of party democracy, the split was inevitable. The developing struggle. With the beginning of the fateful year, 1919, the internal party struggle became more and more intense. By then the central issues between the two major party groupings had become clearly crystallized: class struggle against class collaboration, proletarian internationalism against national chauvinism, proletarian dictatorship against bourgeois democracy, the Third International against the Second International. Cis. In New York, the left wing was making rapid headway in winning locals, only to have them immediately reorganized and screened under right-wing leadership by the party bosses. Nevertheless, the party branches in Brooklyn, the Bronx, and Queens quickly came under left-wing leadership. On February 15, 1919, when the Central Committee of the Greater New York Locals of the Socialist Party, dominated by Julius Gerber, refused to censure the local socialist aldermen for supporting the war, the representatives of 20 left-wing locals from various parts of the city came together in a conference to take action. After listening to talks by John Reed, Jim Larkin, Rose Pastor Stokes, and by representatives of various federations, the conference organized itself as the left-wing section of the Socialist Party and elected officers. The conference also decided to publish a manifesto, and to issue a paper, which appeared on April 19, 1919, as the New York Communist, with John Reed as editor. The left wing can be said to have come into being as an organized force at this date. Chicago, Boston, Cleveland, and other centers, taking the New York Manifesto as their basis of policy, soon followed New York's example. Meanwhile, important events quickly followed one another in the national sphere. For one thing, in answer to the call for a conference in March in Moscow to organize the Communist International, the left wing had submitted to the SP in good time a referendum proposal to the effect that the Socialist Party should participate in an international congress or conference called by or in which participate the Communist Party of Russia and the Communist Party, Spartacus, of Germany. The referendum carried by a huge majority, but the wily Hillquit held up the returns until May, 2 months after the founding conference of the Comintern had been held. Then came the national elections within the party, which were also, as usual, conducted by referendum vote. Held early in the spring of 1919, the elections resulted in a sweeping victory for the left wing. Even such outstanding right-wing leaders as Hillquit and Berger went down to ignominious defeat. But Hillquit, with his rule or ruin policy, refused to make public the unfavorable returns. The election figures, as finally authenticated by the left wing, showed that for the post of International Secretary Hillquit had received only 4,775 votes, as against 13,262 for Kate Richards O'Hare, and for the second international representative, Berger had been swamped by John Reed to the tune of 17,235 votes to 4,871. The left wing also elected 12 of the 15 members of the National Executive Committee. Ruthenberg and Wagenknecht were elected to the National Executive Committee with over 10,000 votes each, or from 3 to 5 times as many as the corresponding right-wing candidates. Hillquit's Pink Terror. The significance of these events was not lost upon the party's official leaders. They saw clearly that if inner democracy were to be continued, the left wing would surely win national control of the party. Therefore, resolved to hold on come what might, they embarked upon a policy of expulsions which had never been equaled, even by the ultra-reactionary AFL leadership. The expelled members and organizations were given no semblance of trials, nor were formal charges even preferred against them. The National Executive Committee, in its May 24 to 30, 1919, meeting, arbitrarily expelled the Michigan State Organization with 6,000 members, and it expelled, the Russian, Lithuanian, Polish, Lettish, Hungarian, Ukrainian, and South Slav federations, with a total of over 40,000 members. The right-wing leadership especially wanted to get rid of the rapidly growing federations, whose militant spirit, based on abominable conditions in American industry, also largely reflected the revolutionary situations in their respective native countries. In the succeeding weeks, the state organizations of Massachusetts and Ohio were also expelled, and along with them the party organization in Chicago and whole groups of locals in New York and in various other centers. In all these sections of the party the left held large majorities. Finally, a total of at least 55,000 members had been dictatorially driven out of the party. At the same notorious May meeting the National Executive Committee set aside the results of the national election referendum and transferred the entire property of the party to a corporation of 7 members. The men who committed this crime against party unity and democracy were A. Shiplikoff, James O'Neill, G. H. Goebel, Fred Kraft, Seymour, Stedman, Dan Hogan, John M. Work, and M. Holt. The 2 left-wing members present at this infamous meeting, Alfred Wagenknecht and L. E. Catterfeld, were powerless to halt the outrageous proceedings. 5. National Executive Committee members were absent. Hillquit, then sick in the hospital, engineered the whole shameful business. Meanwhile, on May 5, a call had gone forth summoning a national conference of the left wing to take action in the party crisis. It was signed by local Boston, local Cleveland, and the left-wing section of the SP of New York. The call aroused tremendous enthusiasm within the socialist ranks, and the membership rallied to support it. The wholesale expulsions perpetrated by the National Executive Committee majorities served to intensify the conflict. The National Left-Wing Conference. The National Conference of the Left Wing met in New York at Manhattan Lyceum on June 21, 1919. Present were 94 delegates from 20 cities, including New York, Boston, Buffalo, Cleveland, Rochester, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Hartford, Minneapolis, Duluth, St. Paul, Detroit, Kansas City, Denver, and Oakland. The delegates represented the bulk of the membership of the Socialist Party. The main purposes of the gathering, as stated in the call under which the conference had assembled, were to formulate a national declaration of left-wing principles, form a national unified expression of the left wing, a sort of general council, not a separate organization, and concentrate our forces to conquer the Party for Revolutionary Socialism. Hardly had the conference gotten underway, however, when a serious division took place within it. This was caused by a statement by Dennis E. Batt of Detroit, later a renegade, to the effect that immediate steps were being taken by his group to form a communist party on September 1st in Chicago, and proposing that this be the line of the conference. Behind Batt's proposition stood the Michigan District and the 7 ousted federations. This was the beginning of a deep split in American communist ranks which took 2.5 years to heal. Those who advocated forming a communist party at once took the position that there was little or no prospect of capturing the SP Special Convention, scheduled for Chicago on August 5th. That the right-wing officials would hang on to control despite all attempts to oust them. That it was useless to capture a completely discredited party, and that the historic moment had now struck to form the Communist Party. The opposing group, which included such as John Reed, Charles E. Ruthenberg, Alfred Wagenknecht, Alexander Bittelman, W. Weinstone, and Charles Crumbean, maintained, on the contrary, that the present tactic of fighting to secure control of the SP, in the name of the party majority, was winning the support of the mass of the rank and file. That it was exposing the Hillquit leaders, with their ruthless expulsions, as the real splitters, and that, in order to win over the still wavering groups in the party, this policy should be continued up to the August Goth Convention. The latter, undoubtedly the more flexible and more correct position, was calculated to win the greatest body of supporters for the new party. The dispute over tactics occupied the main attention of the left-wing National Conference. After 3 days of deliberation, Batt's proposal to quit the struggle inside the $P and to proceed directly to launch the CP was voted down, 55 to 38. The majority decided that this conference shall organize as the left-wing section of the Socialist Party and shall have as its object the capturing of the Socialist Party for Revolutionary Socialism. This was carried by a vote of 43 to 14, with 14 abstaining. The conference, as part of its general tactical line, also decided that it would elect left-wing delegates, including the expelled organizations, to the SP Convention, that it would seek to have the SP Convention adopt the left-wing manifesto as the basis of its program, that it would fight for affiliation of the SP to the Communist International, that the results of the national election referendum should be accepted, and that, if through the courts and the police, the right-wing leaders should maintain control of the convention, then the Communist Party should be formed at once. The Michigan Federation Group refused to abide by these decisions. They let it be known to the conference that, regardless of that body's decisions, they were going to abandon work within the SP and in any event would orient themselves toward launching the Communist Party in Chicago on September 1st. The communist ranks were deeply split. The National Left-Wing Conference provided for the publication of a manifesto and program. It also established headquarters in New York and made the Revolutionary Age its official organ. The conference selected a national council of 9. Among these were Charles E. Ruthenberg, John Ballum, I. E. Ferguson, James Larkin, and Edmund McAlpine. Ferguson was chosen national secretary. The conference also issued a call for a convention in Chicago, on September 1st, of all revolutionary elements that would unite with a revolutionary socialist party or with a new communist party. The SP leaders, as the date of their Chicago convention approached, intensified the expulsion campaign, and the left wing also busily mobilized its forces. Meanwhile, on July 26-27, the left-wing National Executive Committee members who had been elected in the national referendum, but not recognized by the SP-controlling clique, held a meeting in Chicago. This meeting claimed to be the legitimate National Executive Committee of the SP, and it elected L. E. Catterfeld Party Chairman, and Alfred Wagenknecht National Secretary. Adolf Germer, SP Executive Secretary, was removed and instructed to turn over the effects of the party to Wagenknecht. But this line of policy was not aggressively pushed, and the new left-wing National Executive Committee of the SP played little part in the big struggle now rushing fast to a climax. In an effort to heal the breach in the communist ranks, a conference of both communist factions was held in August. This meeting, by a vote of 7-2, decided to support the proposition of launching the CP on September 1st, Ruthenberg and other council leaders, in the meantime, having gone over to the Michigan Federation's policy. Therefore, a joint call for a Communist Party convention on September 1st was issued, signed by the National Left-Wing Council and the National Organizing Committee, Michigan Federations Group. But the National Council minority, headed by John Reed and Alfred Wagenknecht, refused to accept this decision and continued with the original policy of the council, to try to win control of the SP. Unity had not been achieved, and the two communist factions continued to work at cross purposes. The Left-Wing Manifesto. At this point it may be well for us to make a brief analysis of the National Council's Left-Wing Manifesto, upon the basis of which the American Communist movement was being organized. This manifesto, differing little from the original New York left-wing manifesto, eventually served also, with only minor changes, as the basis for the programs of the two communist parties soon to be born. The manifesto correctly condemned the whole political line, root and branch, of the right-wing SP leadership. It accused Hillquit and company of basing the party program upon the petty bourgeoisie and the skilled aristocracy of labor, of failing to support industrial unionism and the workers' economic struggles, of surrendering to Gompersism, of carrying on an opportunist parliamentary policy, of sabotaging the struggle against the war, of opposing the Russian Revolution, of accepting a Wilsonian peace, of supporting the decayed Second International, and of generally carrying on a policy of reform which led, not to socialism, but to the perpetuation of capitalism. As against this policy of reformism and class collaboration, the left-wing manifesto outlined a policy of militant struggle in both the industrial and political fields. It proposed basing the party and its program upon the proletariat, full support of industrial unionism, relentless war against Gompersism, revolutionary parliamentarism, support of the Russian Revolution, affiliation to the Communist International, and a program aimed at the abolition of the capitalist system and the establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat. The manifesto registered a long stride by the left wing toward a Marxist-Leninist policy. It was an enormous qualitative advance over pre-war programs of the left, such as the Industrial Socialism, Haywood-Bone platform of 1911. The previous left line had been saturated with sectarianism and syndicalism, whereas the 1919 program was predominantly Marxist-Leninist. Among its good points, the manifesto presented an essentially sound analysis of American imperialism, a lack of which in years past had been a grave weakness of the left. The manifesto also made a clear analysis of the recent imperialist war, which was also a vast improvement over the pacifist conceptions that had underscored hitherto prevailed in the party, even in its left wing. Another big step forward in the manifesto was its Marxist analysis of the state, both in its capitalist and socialist forms. In particular, its presentation of the dictatorship of the proletariat, while exhibiting some hangovers of Deleanism, was a marked advance over the previously prevailing syndicalist ideas of a labor union state. The program of organized mass action, as the way to socialism, showed the left wing was beginning to free itself of Deleonide illusions about locking out the capitalists, folded arms general strikes, and other fantasies. The manifesto also laid great stress upon the leading role of the party, as against a gross underestimation of the party in the past. That is to say, the manifesto, aside from such theoretical weaknesses as its failure to analyze social democracy correctly, marked real progress toward grasping the general theoretical principles of Marxism-Leninism, in the broad sense indicated above. On the negative side, however, the manifesto showed little skill in applying these correct fundamentals to the specific situation in the United States. The American communists had gotten a first grasp upon the powerful weapon of Marxist-Leninist analysis, but they had not yet learned how to use it correctly. They were still far from having mastered Lenin's great lesson that Marxism is not a dogma, but a guide to action, a weakness that was to plague the party for many years. Particularly with regard to the basic question of the road to the abolition of capitalism and the establishment of socialism, there was a tendency to overlook specific American conditions and to think mechanically in terms of the experience of the Russian Revolution. This weakness made for political rigidity, and it tended to stimulate long-existing sectarian tendencies. 168. History of the Communist Party. The manifesto, in its theoretical approach, dealt decisive blows against the opportunist right wing and also against sectarian errors of the left in the past, but on its practical side it did not even partially liquidate the leftist sectarianism which had always been a heavy handicap to the American Marxist movement, especially since the theoretical predominance of de Leon after 1890. By blocking broad united coalition action on immediate political, economic, and legislative issues. The left-wing manifesto, in fact, fairly reeked with this traditional sectarianism in practice. It continued the incorrect line of attempting to desert the old trade unions and to replace them with ideally conceived, dual industrial unions. It also took a narrow position toward the Labor Party, repudiating it as a danger to the working class. It likewise failed completely to develop a program of united front action with labor's natural allies, especially the Negro people and the farmers, considering the anti-capitalist struggle to be one for the working class alone. It ignored generally the basic Negro question. It also left the matter of partial demands completely out of the picture, and it reduced its parliamentary activities simply to one of agitation. The conception of an immediate, as well as an ultimate, program did not enter into the document. As Alexander Bittelman says, the left wing did not seem to realize that revolutionary mass action grows out only of the real living issues of the class struggle, as it develops day by day. Thus, it will be seen from the manifesto that the Communist Party, in its two sections, was born while in the midst of absorbing the great meaning of the Russian Revolution and of learning the basic essentials of Marxism-Leninism. This indefinite position was a handicap to it and was basically responsible for the party's later struggles to heal the split and to achieve a more correct, broad mass program. Ruthenberg noted this fact, registered remarking that most of the European Communist parties were organized at later periods than ours, to their advantage. Whereas the American Communist Party was born in September 1919, the dates of other communist parties were England, August 1920, Germany, early in 1921, France, January 1921, Italy, 1921. By their later dates of birth, these parties were far better prepared ideologically to take up the tasks of independent parties than was the case in the United States. But the general situation in the United States, as we have seen, Bittleman, Milestones in the History of the Communist Party, p. 42. The first installment of Lenin's State and Revolution was not published until 2 months before the left-wing National Conference, the Communist, February 1919, and Lenin's famous left-wing Communism, an Infantile Disorder, with its devastating attack upon all forms of sectarianism, was not published until 1920, almost a year after the 1919 Party Convention. 3. Charles E. Ruthenberg in the Communist, July 1921. N.N. Dissoned irresistibly the birth of the Communist Party at the time it actually took place. It could not have been delayed. The decline of the Socialist Party. The split, now so rapidly coming to a crisis, was to prove disastrous to the Socialist Party. After the break, the membership dropped swiftly from 104,822 in 1919 to but 26,766 in 1920. The decline continued, until it had sunk to 7,425 in 1927. At the present time, in 1952, the SP has probably not over 4,000 members. The party's mass influence also tobogganed. It became a prey to internal dissensions, and finally splitting in 1936, it gave birth to the bourgeois Social Democratic Federation. Moreover, the SP has degenerated politically to the extent that, as we shall see, it has become an unblushing supporter of warlike American imperialism. The Socialist Party came into existence as a sound reaction against the sectarian dogmatism of the Socialist Labor Party. After 25 years of existence, the latter had remained a skeleton organization, made up mainly of foreign-born workers, propagating socialism abstractly, and carrying on few activities related to the everyday problems of the American working class. The SLP's chronic failure to measure up to the needs of the period became especially glaring as the United States entered the stage of imperialism and the working class embarked upon broad mass struggles. Manifestly, the SLP could not be the vanguard party of the working class in this situation, hence the flag of socialist leadership passed to the Socialist Party. In its earlier stages, the Socialist Party displayed great activity in the class struggle. In the innumerable strikes of the period, the socialist workers were most active. Large numbers of trade unions were organized by socialists, and party members were always prominent in unionizing campaigns, labor defense cases, farmers' struggles, and the like. For many years the party, which was composed overwhelmingly of workers, fought the corrupt and reactionary Gompers machine. The party also carried on much valuable anti-capitalist propaganda among the workers. This is why it grew so rapidly and became an important political factor in the country. The healthy aspects of these accomplishments were the work primarily of the party's proletarian left wing. But, as we have seen, the Socialist Party, despite its considerable early achievements, also failed to live up to the tasks placed upon it by history, specifically by the era of imperialism into which it was born. It was not the needed party of a new type, but was patterned after the opportunist-dominated Social Democratic Party of Germany. From the outset it was crippled by a petty bourgeois leadership and afflicted with a bourgeois ideology rather than that of Marxist socialism. The reformist party leaders proved incapable of giving the necessary economic and political leadership to the working class. The party also suffered from strong sectarian and syndicalist tendencies in its left wing, which greatly hindered its development. The failure of the party, under opportunist leadership, to act as the vanguard of the working class inevitably produced within it the development of a strong left wing, fighting for a real class struggle policy. The growth of this left wing was the gestation of the Communist Party. The new party finally and inevitably came to birth in the fire of World War I and the Russian Revolution. The SP opportunist petty bourgeois leadership had especially failed to understand the political lessons of these great events, but, in meeting them, it definitely exposed itself instead as an enemy of the socialist system that had just been established. The leadership of the socialist movement in the United States, therefore, had to and did pass from the Socialist Party to a new organization, one truly socialist in character, the Communist Party. 12. The formation of the Communist Party, 1919 to 1921. The Socialist Party Convention opened on August 30, 1919, in Machinists Hall, 113 South Ashland Boulevard, Chicago. The Hillquit clique had complete control of the party apparatus, and from the outset they used this control drastically. Their contest committee, passing on challenge credentials, refused seats to delegates of the left wing from a dozen states. When John Reed and other left-wingers nevertheless tried to take their seats, Executive Secretary Germer called in the police to expel them. At this outrage, the left-wing delegates walked out. The long brewing division between the right and left wings had now reached the final stage of an open, organizational split. The two communist conventions. Meanwhile, the two communist groups went ahead with organizing their separate conventions. Sharp criticisms were flying back and forth between the factions. The Reed-Wagenknecht group, after their expulsion from the SP convention, at first claimed to be the legitimate SP, but on the day following, August 31st, they went to the IWW Hall, 129 Troop Street, and formed themselves into the Communist Labor Party of America. A day later, on September East, at 1221 Blue Island Avenue, the Michigan Federations Group organized the Communist Party of America. The CP, containing the federations, was much the larger of the two new parties. It had 128 regular and fraternal delegates and claimed a membership of 58,000. The CLP had 92 delegates at its convention. It issued no figures as to membership, which was mainly American-born, but it was obviously very much smaller than the CP. The CP asserted that the CLP had about 10,000 members. Efforts were made to unite the two conventions, especially by Ruthenberg, but without success. The CP criticized the CLP as centrist, and declared that if the latter wanted unity the CLP delegates could come over to the CP convent. 172. History of the Communist Party Tion and participate there as fraternal delegates. This proposition, of course, the CLP scorned. Meanwhile, the Michigan group at the CP convention, led by Batt and Carricker, took exception to the strong control exercised by the Federation leaders and refused to vote for the CP program. This group was expelled on December 2, after which in June 1920, they organized themselves as the Proletarian Party, a wisp of a party which still exists. Ruthenberg was elected executive secretary of the CP and Wagenknecht was chosen for the same position in the CLP. The Communist became the organ of the CP, and the Toiler, formerly the Socialist. News, the journal of the CLP. The CP set up its headquarters in Chicago and the CLP moved to Cleveland. The CP had 12 publications in its language federations. Both U.S. Communist parties extended their organization into Canada. In June 1921, however, the two groups were fused into one Communist Party, which was born underground. The Workers' Party of Canada was founded in February 1922. In June 1943, the CP of Canada was reorganized into the present Labour Progressive Party. The communist programs. The programs of the two parties were essentially the same. Their strengths and weaknesses were those of the left-wing manifesto, upon which they were based and which we analyzed in the preceding EA chapter. That is, they developed a basically correct Marxist-Leninist position on such general questions as the state, imperialism, the war, and proletarian dictatorship, but they failed in applying Marxist-Leninist principles to the concrete American situation. In the latter respect, they largely remained clamped in the traditional sectarianism and leftism. Thus, on the trade union question, dualism expressed itself in both parties. The CP, for example, proposed the formation of a General Industrial Union organization embracing the IWW, WL1, U3 independent and secession unions, militant unions of the AFL, and the unorganized workers, on the basis of the revolutionary class struggle. The CLP also took a dual union line. The CLP did not mention the Negro question at all, and the CP outlined the incorrect, but generally held opinion in the word de Leonite formula that the racial expression of the Negro is simply the expression of his economic bondage and oppression, each intensifying the other. This complicates the Negro problem, but does not alter its proletarian character. Both parties proposed to have nothing to do with partial, immediate political demands. The CP said that its parliamentary representatives shall not introduce or support reform measures, and the CLP declared that its platform can contain only one demand: the establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Parliamentary action was thus reduced to a question of agitation of revolutionary formulas. The parties' platforms were also incorrect in their approach to the question of the workers' potential United Front allies in the class struggle. For example, said the CP, the Communist Party, accordingly, in campaigns and elections, and in all its other activities, shall not cooperate with groups or parties not committed to the revolutionary class struggle, such as the Socialist Party, Labor Party, Nonpartisan League, People's Council, Municipal Leaguers, etc. The CLP was no less leftist. Both parties declared for affiliation to the Communist International. Both also stressed the leading role of the party, but this they did in an abstract manner, failing to realize that the party had to be the leader not only in periods of revolutionary struggle but also in every day-to-day issue of the working class, no matter how small. The political basis of the leftism that prevailed in both parties was a wrong estimate of the general political situation in the United States. The tacit assumption of both parties was that the country was approaching a revolutionary crisis. Thus, the CLP program realizes that the time for parleying and compromise has passed, and that now it is only the question whether all power remains in the hands of the capitalists or is taken by the working class. The CP program expressed a similar spirit of revolutionary urgency. Little analysis was developed at the time of this key proposition, however. Much of Europe then was in a revolutionary situation. Moreover, the revolution in Germany, had it not been betrayed by the Social Democrats, could have spread widely, thereby directly affecting the United States. It was therefore quite correct for the American Communist parties to have a general socialist perspective. Their mistake was in conceiving this in an altogether too immediate sense and in a mechanical fashion. They failed to make a clear distinction between a Europe devastated by the war and the scene of active revolutionary struggle, and a capitalist America enriched by the war and by no means ready for socialism. This faulty analysis contributed directly to the young Communist Party's underestimation and neglect of the daily struggles of the workers for partial demands. Raising the slogan of Soviets for the United States was a serious political error, indicating the political immaturity of the party. The two conventions, between them, laid the organizational and political foundations for the eventual Communist Party of the United States. But many urgent tasks confronted this young and split movement. The first and most important of these was to bring about unity between the two communist parties. There were also very many left-wing elements still to be assembled, including sections remaining in the SP's the more advanced IWW members, the militants in the AFL, and other groupings moving toward Marxist socialism. Above all, there was the necessity of securing a better grasp upon the great theoretical principles of Marxism-Leninism so newly come to the knowledge of the American left wing. But before these urgent tasks could be done, the movement was to undergo its first test by fire. The Palmer Raids. The Communist Party of the United States was born in the midst of sharp economic and political struggles, both abroad and at home. The Russian Revolution was surging ahead, smashing the armies of the counter-revolutionary interventionists, and Germany and all of Central and Eastern Europe were stirring with revolutionary spirit. In the United States, the workers, reflecting something of the revolutionary mood of the working class in many countries, were fighting on the offensive. The historic Seattle and Winnipeg general strikes were still fresh in memory, and the Great Steel Strike, a thrust by over 1/3 workers at the very heart of the open shop industries, was just beginning. In this situation came the formation of the party, the most advanced expression of the workers' militancy and fighting spirit. The capitalists, frightened at all these threatening developments, were beginning their intense post-war offensive to give the workers another bitter taste of the democracy they had saved by winning the war. They arbitrarily used the state power for the illegal suppression of the people's rights. This growing employers' offensive hit the communist parties with full force in the infamous Palmer Raids at the end of 1919. On October 16 of that year, the police pushed into the CLP headquarters in Cleveland and arrested the party leadership, and on November 8, in New York, 700 police invaded mass meetings celebrating the anniversary of the Russian Revolution, seizing several hundred workers. But these raids were only dress rehearsals for the big outrages yet to come. Suddenly, during the night of January 2, 1920, the Department of Justice struck nationally in 70 cities, dragging workers from their homes, slugging them, and throwing them into crowded jails, often without proper food and toilet facilities. These monstrous raids, authorized by the liberal President Wilson, were carried out by Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer and his hatchet man, J. Edgar Hoover. Allegedly, the country was on the brink of a revolution, and this was the way to save it, regardless of law and constitutional rights. An estimated 10,000 were arrested. Most of the two Communist Party's leaders were in jail, 39 of the officials of the CLP being indicted. Eventually, Ruthenberg, Larkin, Winitsky, Whitney, and others, arrested during the period of the raids, were sentenced to long terms in the penitentiary. The government struck hardest at the foreign-born workers, whom it considered the most dangerously revolutionary. Under the Wartime Deportation Act, over 500 aliens were summarily deported. On the steamer Buford, sailing from New York, there were 249 deportees, including Alexander Berkman and Emma Goldman. In the prevailing hysteria, Victor Berger, although regularly elected, was refused a seat in the House of Representatives, and 5 socialist assemblymen were denied their places in the New York State Legislature. This terrorist attack, accompanied by rulings of the Department of Labor that foreign-born members of the communist movement were deportable as such, deprived the two communist parties of their basic rights of free speech and free assembly. It forced them to close their national headquarters and to take other elementary steps to protect their members, branches, press, and leading committees from arbitrary raids and terrorist victimization. That is, faced by illegal attacks designed to outlaw the communist movement and to drive it underground, the two parties reacted as various other labor and progressive movements before them had done in American history when facing similar persecution. They adopted protective measures and pursued their legitimate activities as best they could under the circumstances. No constructive political movement will allow itself to be destroyed by police persecution. The term, underground, in relation to the party's position during these years of persecution, was greatly exaggerated and distorted in the press. The fact was, however, that A. Mitchell Palmer, J. Edgar Hoover, and the others carrying out the offensive against the communists did not succeed in stopping completely the open and public activities of the communist movement, which persisted in spite of the government's EF-1 Senator T. J. Walsh in Congressional Record, 67th Congress, 4th Session, p. 3005. 2. Robert W. Dunn, ed. The Palmer Raids, N. Y. 1948. Forts to drive it underground. Despite violence, threats of violence, vigilante action, and similar illegal policies, either practiced directly or condoned by the authorities, the parties openly published various journals, such as the Toiler of the UCP and Der Kampf, the first Jewish communist paper in the United States. Books and pamphlets were also sold openly, and the language federations, for the most part, managed to operate their homes and keep their papers going. The Workers' Council also functioned openly and published its paper. The term, illegal, as applied to the status of the two parties during this period, was a misnomer. In reality, the advocacy of the party's programs and the practice of their general activities were legal, in that they were entirely within the Constitution, but because of the prevailing violent and illegal suppression, the party was unable to exercise these democratic rights openly. Proof of the correctness of this analysis was to be seen in the fact that once the Palmer terror was over and the communist parties had succeeded in practice in establishing their democratic rights, the legal status of the Communist Party was not challenged by the national government for 25 years. That is, until a new governmental terrorism was launched as an integral part of Wall Street's present drive to master the world. During the following months, the communist parties, both of which had moved to New York, were busily occupied reorganizing themselves, their branches, papers, and leading committees, in accordance with the new situation. When, later on, in their 1920 conventions the parties took stock of their membership, they found that they had held together only about 10,000 degrees out of the approximately 60,000, who had earlier flocked to the standard of the left wing. The Palmer raids had seriously weakened the party's numerical strength, but had by no means broken their backs. They were now reduced to the hard core of resolute communist fighters. Their reduction in size after the government's ruthless onslaught was not surprising. During the terror following the 1905 revolution in Russia, for example, the Bolshevik party was greatly reduced in numbers. Similar shrinking in size, but not in revolutionary spirit, was later to be observed of the Communist Party of China under Chiang Kai-shek's terror, and also of the parties in many European countries under the ruthless fascist regimes. The 50,000 or so of erstwhile members who dropped out of the communist parties in the United States under the Palmer terror generally became non-member supporters and sympathizers of the party. Formation of the United Communist Party. Obviously, party unity in the United States was a burning necessity. The leaders of the Communist Labor Party, from the time of the conventions, pressed for a consolidation of the two parties, but the Federation leaders in the Communist Party were reluctant. Their unity proposition to the CLP was, in substance, that the latter should join up with the CP as individuals and locals. Unity with the CLP as a party of centrists, said they, was impossible. The Federation leaders raised two definite issues, which stood in the way of unity. First, they charged that the CLP leaders were opportunists, holding that their own members, mostly foreign-born, were imbued with a more revolutionary spirit than the predominantly American-born CLP membership. Second, they feared that the CLP leaders, underestimating the role of the foreign-born generally in the class struggle, would destroy the language federations, not realizing what a powerful means these were for organizing the foreign-born workers of the respective national groups, most of whom at that time did not speak English. A further general bar to unity was the fact that, since they were in the process of grasping the great body of Marxist-Leninist thought, there was a tendency in both parties to magnify the importance of every detail of difference, to dispute over minor points with rigidity, and to apply Marxism-Leninism to the United States in a blueprint fashion, rather than upon the basis of actual American conditions. This sectarian attitude led to secondary splits in the parties during this formative period. Notwithstanding these differences, the two parties, early in 1920, began unity negotiations. Ruthenberg, executive secretary of the CP, was an ardent advocate of party unity in that body. Despite these efforts, the unity proceedings dragged on without any results, with each side voting down the proposals of the other. Finally, the CP itself split over the unity question, with a large section of that organization, led by Ruthenberg, joining up with the CLP. Segments broke off from several of the federations, and the bulk of the Jewish Federation, led by Alexander Biddleman, disaffiliated from the CP and joined the CLP. A unity convention was held at Bridgman, Michigan, in May 1920. As a result, the United Communist Party of America was born. Ruthenberg was elected executive secretary, and the new Central Executive Committee was made up of 5 members from the CP and 5 from the CLP. The UCP made no important changes in political policy from that of the CLP and CP. The big question at issue in the convention was the role of the federations. The CP was practically a federation of federations. These bodies had a high degree of autonomy, holding their own conventions, electing their officials, and having the power, used upon occasion, if they saw fit, to withdraw from the party. The UCP, on the other hand, was opposed to this loose system. While authorizing federations, the UCP declared that these would hold national conferences, not conventions, and that their decisions, activities, officials, and journals were all to be under the direct control of the Central Executive Committee. The basic party unit was set by the convention at not more than 10 or less than 5 members. The CP, in turn, held its convention of 34 delegates, also, underground, in July 1920, in New York City. There was much bitterness over the recent unity proceedings, which had split the CP, and the new UCP was dubbed the United Centrist Party. No important programmatic changes were made by the CP. Incorrectly, however, the UCP was accused of giving undue prominence to the Negro tilde question in its convention by considering it as a separate item. Reports to the CP convention showed that whereas the total dues payments of the CP for the last 3 months of 1919 averaged $23,744 per month, the number was down to $5,584 for the first 4 months of 1920. The estimated membership at convention time was 8,500. It was reported that 18% of the membership had been lost to the UCP in the unity proceedings. Charles Durba was elected executive secretary of the CP. The role of the Communist International. Founded in March 1919, the Comintern, by the time of its second Congress in July 1920, was actively functioning. Henceforth, during the next 20 years, the American communist movement was to have the invaluable advantage of the advice and experience of the Marxist-Leninists of the world in the development of communist policy in the United States. This was of great importance because the American left had been practically isolated from the left wing in other countries since the death of Engels in 1895. The Communist International, made up in its congresses and leading committees of worker delegates from all over the world, was a highly democratic organization, far more so, in fact, than the Second International had ever been. No decisions were arrived at without the most thorough discussions with the delegations directly concerned. Charges by social democrats and other capitalist agents that the Comintern issued arbitrary orders and directives to its affiliates were only so many examples of the current anti-communist slander campaign. Stalin, years ago, answered this calumny. The assumption that the American communists work under orders from Moscow is absolutely untrue. There are no communists in the world who would agree to work under orders from outside against their own convictions and will and contrary to the requirements of the situation. Even if there were such communists, they would not be worth a cent. The Comintern was a disciplined organization, and international capitalism dreaded its decisive action. But its Leninist discipline was based upon a profound democracy throughout its entire structure. Enemies of communism also made many fantastic charges about the Comintern sending its agents to various countries, including the United States. These delegates were painted in an especially sinister fashion. In reality, however, with respect to its representatives traveling to various countries, the Comintern functioned much like any other international labor body. Such representatives, members of brother communist parties, simply undertook to give the parties concerned the benefit of their own particular experience in the light of the general policies and decisions of the Comintern. Stupid and baseless also was the charge that the existence of the Communist International, and now of the respective communist parties, since the Comintern was liquidated, constituted interference by the Soviet Union in the internal affairs of other countries. The Comintern was a movement, based on the communist parties of all the major countries in the world and growing out of the socialist movement, which had been developing for at least 75 years before the USSR was born. Among its many general decisions, the Second Congress of the Comintern, in July 1920, formulated 3 of special importance. These were the well-known 21 points, the colonial resolution, and the development of the policies laid down in Lenin's famous pamphlet, Left-Wing Communism, an Infantile Disorder. The 21 points laid down the working principles of the communist movement, both on a national and international scale, in the intense revolutionary situation then existing. The points provided for a revolutionary party, in regard to its membership, leadership, policy, press, and discipline. Their primary purpose was to establish what a communist party should be in order to lead the masses. CPA. D struggle then rapidly developing in Europe. The points were guides, not inflexible rules. In the practice of the various communist parties, they were widely varied. At this time the 2 American communist parties were only in fraternal affiliation with the Comintern, and the Communist Movement of the United States, after its eventual unity, never officially endorsed the 21 points. If the 21 points were a devastating blow against the right, Lenin's left-wing communism and infantile disorder was no less sharp an attack against the ultra-left. It was a slashing assault upon sectarianism among communists in all its forms. In this great booklet, Lenin especially demolished the illusion of dual socialist unionism, using among other illustrations the experience in this matter in the United States. Lenin also cracked down on such virulent forms of leftism as non-participation in bourgeois parliaments, refusal to fight for partial demands, failure to develop fighting alliances with labor's small farmer and other allies, tendencies to try to apply the Russian experience mechanically in other countries, and the like. The Colonial Resolution, written by Lenin, was of major importance. It explained the relations between the struggle of the working class in the imperialist countries and those of the colonial peoples fighting for national independence. It clearly forecast the immense revolutionary struggles now shaking the whole colonial world. Party unity achieved. Despite the failure of the UCP Convention of May 1920 to establish party unity, strong rank and file pressure continued in that direction. The UCP leadership also redoubled its unity agitation. A Communist Unity Committee, headed by Alexander Bittelman, member of the UCP, criticized the leadership of both parties and insisted upon immediate party unification. Moreover, the Comintern lent its influence. The CP Federation leaders yielded under the strong unity urge in the party. Consequently, unity negotiations were begun shortly after the first UCP convention, but they dragged along slowly, deadlocks occurring over the matter of representation at the proposed unity convention. The CP also insisted upon autonomy for the federations, asserting besides that the UCP was not sufficiently revolutionary. The separate conventions of the UCP in January and of the CP in February 1921, both held without any open publicity, gave new strength to the movement for unity. Finally, after much negotiation, the General Convention to unify the CP and UCP took place in May, at Woodstock, New York. Each party was represented by 30 delegates. The convention lasted for 2 weeks. The UCP reported 5,700 members, organized into 667 groups, and 35 publications. The CP reported a dues-paying membership of 6,328 in 19 newspapers. Each party stated that it had issued some 2 million copies of leaflets during the past few months. The debates at the convention, although heated, brought forth no important political differences between the two groups. The main discussions turned around questions of tactics, especially on how to break the party's isolation and how to apply the principles of Marxism-Leninism in the sharp class struggles then going on. On this question, the influence of Lenin's writings, particularly his left-wing communism and infantile disorder, was in evidence. The most important change in policy adopted by the convention was the abandonment of the historic left-wing policy of dual unionism. In this respect, the convention declared that the policy of the IWW and similar organizations of artificially creating new industrial unions has been shown by experience to be mistaken, and the Communist Party condemns the policy of the revolutionary elements leaving the existing unions. This stand against dual unionism constituted a heavy blow against sectarianism, but the party was not yet prepared to draw the full implications from its new tactical line, particularly as expressed in Lenin's pamphlet against leftism. While endorsing the principle of partial demands, it developed no program of such demands. The party also, in its Unity Convention, while speaking for cooperation with the exploited rural masses, worked out no practical united front policies for so doing. Nor was it, as yet, prepared to endorse the Labor Party movement. And as for the Negro question, little or no progress was made on this. The matter was not included in the party's program, but was referred to the manifesto. Despite these many shortcomings, however, the convention's proceedings, above all in the abandonment of dual unionism, went far toward the elaboration of a sound Marxist-Leninist mass policy for the United States. A serious dispute at the UCP circa P. Unity Convention took place over party structure. The role of the federations was the principal bone of contention. Finally, a compromise was arrived at which held the federations under general party control, while allowing them considerable autonomy. Henceforth, the federations would hold conferences, not conventions. They would be subject to general supervision of the Central Executive Committee, and their members would have to pay their dues directly to the party. The fused organization was called the Communist Party of America, and its headquarters was established in New York. Ruthenberg was elected executive secretary. Stead of the proposed 9 members, had to be enlarged to 10, 5 from each constituent party. It was a joyous delegation that completed the arduous work of this long and decisive convention. Amid the general enthusiasm of the convention, party lines melted away. Comrades, who had been separated for years, embraced each other. Hands clasped hands. The delegates sang the International with as much energy as could be mustered after the trying 48-hour continuous sessions. Concentrating the communist forces. Meanwhile, as the former left wing of the Socialist Party, now crystallized into the Communist Party, went ahead unifying itself and developing an American Marxist-Leninist program, it was also absorbing strength from other militant currents. First, there was the IWW. From the outset, the Communists exerted great effort to win over members of this fighting organization. In January 1920, the Comintern addressed a special letter to the IWW, polemizing against its syndicalist illusions and offering it the hand of brotherhood. Many of its outstanding leaders turned to the party, including William D. Haywood, George Hardy, Art Shields, and Roy Brown. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, who joined the party some years later, also came from the IWW. Haywood declared, "As soon as the consolidation of the Communist Party in the United States was effected, I became a member." He died in Moscow in 1928, where, a sick man, he had gone to avoid a 20-year prison sentence for his anti-war stand. In 1920, the IWW General Executive Board formally endorsed the Communist International. However, because most of the IWW leaders were nevertheless opposed to communism, they finally succeeded in driving a wedge between the IWW and the Communist Party. In the spring of 1921, the IWW sent a delegate to the First Congress of the Red International of Labor Unions in Moscow. But upon receiving an unfavorable, highly biased, report from its delegate, George Williams, on what had happened there, the IWW decided not to affiliate to the new Labor International. Like a number of other syndicalist organizations in Europe and Latin America, the IWW oriented toward the so-called Berlin Syndicalist International, which was being organized at the time. Despite the IWW's strong syndicalist trend, however, considerable numbers of its members became communists. Gams says, possibly, the IWW have lost as many as 2,000 members to the Communist Party. The Socialist Labor Party furnished but few members to the Communist Party: Boris Reinstein, Caleb Harrison, and some others. The SLP, immersed in the sectarian dogmas of de Leon, was totally unable to understand the Russian Revolution and its profound implications for the world labor movement. It condemned the revolution as premature, and ridiculed the CI as only a circus stunt. The SLP soon degenerated into a frenzied red-baiting and Soviet-hating sect. An important development of this period, signalizing the beginning of one of the, eventually, most important of all the membership sources of the Communist Party, was the growth of the communist movement among the Negroes in New York. This took place chiefly around the journal, The Messenger. This paper, of which we shall have more to say in a later chapter, was established in 1917 by a group of Negro intellectuals and trade unionists, including A. Philip Randolph, Chandler, Owen, Richard B. Moore, and Cyril Briggs. The Messenger, which had the backing of many socialist-led trade unions, followed an essentially left line. It opposed the war, supported the Russian Revolution, and was in favor of an active fighting policy for labor and the Negro people. During the period of the SP 1919 split, the editorial board of the Messenger was divided, the lefts, Briggs and Moore, resigning. Randolph, hanging onto the paper, transformed it into a typical right-wing socialist journal. Eventually, in 1925, it became the official organ of the newly organized Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. Out of the Messenger group came several pioneer communists. The youth were also a source of strength for the gathering communist forces. The profound events which had resulted in the split in the Socialist Party and the organization of the Communist Party naturally had its repercussions among the socialist young people. The SP, in April 1913, after several years of preliminary work of the Intercollegiate Socialist Society, had constituted the Young People's Socialist League. The YPSL in 1916 consisted of 150 clubs and 4,000 members. It published The Young Socialist and carried on educational and social work. During the war, the organization, leftward inclined, held many anti-war meetings and made much agitation against conscription. The treacherous attitude of the Social Democratic leaders of the Second International toward the Russian Revolution and the war produced profound repercussions in the YPSL, as in other sections of the American Socialist movement. At the YPSL's first national convention, held in May 1919, this left spirit in the organization found expression. The convention passed resolutions condemning the Second International and supporting the Third International. In December 1919, after the Socialist Party had split in September, the YPSL held a special convention, in response to left-wing demands. It thus set itself up as an independent organization, declaring for the Young Socialist International, which was then in the process of transforming itself into the Young Communist International. When the Palmer raids against the labor and communist movement took place, the independent YPSL disintegrated as a national organization, although some of its sections remained in existence. W.M.F. Cruz, the head of the YPSL, joined the Workers' Party at its formation in December 1921, and many former YPSL members also took part in forming the Young Communist League. The YCL came into existence at a convention in April 1922, in underground conditions. The Young Workers' League was organized in May 1922, out of the numerous youth groups then existing. Among its leaders were Harry Guinness and John Williamson. In the breakdown of the Socialist Party and the formation of the Communist Party in 1919, women socialist fighters also played an important role. Most of them went over to the new party, or became active sympathizers. At the founding convention of the CP and CLP, there were several women delegates. Among the most outstanding of the pioneer women communists may be mentioned Ella Reeve Bloor, Anita Whitney, Margaret Prevey, Kate Sadler Greenhalgh, Rose Pastor Stokes, Hortense Allison, Sadie Van Veen, Jeanette Pearl, Rose Wertis, Margaret Crumbine, Rose Barron, Becky Bouhet, Dora Lifshitz, Clara Bodian. Another important source of recruits for the Communist Party was the Trade Union Educational League. The TUEL, the successor to the old Syndicalist League and International Trade Union Educational League, was founded in Chicago in November 1920. After the loss of the big national steel strike, the group of Chicago militants who were behind that movement more than ever felt the need to organize the militant minority in the trade unions. The organization also included trade unionists in Canada. The TUEL was not so definitely syndicalist as its predecessors, the SLNA and Lieutenant UEL, had been. Its members and leaders were decisively influenced by the lessons of the Great Russian Revolution and by the writings of Lenin. The Chicago Syndicalist Group was a revolt, not only against Gompersism and trade unionism, but also against the right opportunism of the Socialist Party. Hence the works of Lenin had a tremendous impact upon it, even as upon all other sections of militant workers. The group's anti-politicalism was breaking down, and it had played an important part in the Labor Party movement which centered nationally in Chicago. It was rapidly moving toward Marxism-Leninism. In 1920, the chief remaining barrier between the TUEL militants and the Communist Party was their difference over the trade union question, the TUEL being unshakably opposed to dual unionism, which the Communists still supported. This obstacle, however, was removed when Lenin's pamphlet, Left-Wing Communism, an Infantile Disorder, appeared in the United States in January 1921. From then on, dual unionism was finished as communist policy. William Z. Foster, the head of the TUEL, whose thinking had been revolutionized by Lenin, was invited to come to Moscow for the first Congress of the Red International of Labor Unions, held on July 3, 1921. There the RILU definitely repudiated dual unionism. In the summer of 1921, Foster and other TUEL militants joined the party. This brought in a considerable group of active and experienced trade unionists, among them Jack Johnston, Jay Fox, Joseph Manley, David Coots, Sam Hammersmark, and many others. The TUEL, however, remained an independent, broad united front organization, made up of left-wingers and progressives generally. 13. The Workers' Party, 1921. The years immediately following World War I were years of virulent capitalist reaction. We shall deal with this offensive of capital more fully in the next chapter. During this period, the United States went through many hard-fought strikes, numerous race riots, and labor frame-up cases. The labor movement was fighting for its very existence. The severe economic crisis of 1920-21 sharpened the class struggle. This was the time when the Ku Klux Klan, flourishing as never before, claimed to have 5 million members. In order to play an important part in the current big class struggles, it was necessary that the Communist Party should carry on public activities and all kinds of tasks so far as possible under the existing circumstances. The fusing together of the two underground communist parties at the May 1921 convention was a long stride in this general direction. But to get the party fully into the open was no small problem. In fact, it was a unique task, which was to take nearly 2 years to accomplish. The basic difficulty, of course, was to develop the mass work of the party in the face of the reactionary capitalist offensive then going on. There was little known communist experience to serve as a guide in this specific situation. Of course, there were cases of communist parties which, forced underground by capitalist terrorism, had emerged into legality during periods of revolutionary upheaval. Striking examples of this were given by the Bolsheviks during the 1905 and March 1917 revolutions in Russia, and also by the parties in the Balkans after World War I. There were similar experiences later in many European countries upon the defeat of Hitler and the revolutionary upsurge of the working class in the aftermath of World War II. But few, if any, examples were to be found then of communist parties that had legalized themselves during periods of sharp reaction, such as existed in the United States. Besides these objective difficulties to the parties assuming a fully open status in the face of the current capitalist reaction, there were also subjective reasons making this task even more difficult. That is, the sectarianism still prevailing in the party. the tendency to stand apart from the daily struggles of the masses and to deal only with socialist agitation, under the pressure of the force and violence of the authorities, led to the tacit acceptance of underground conditions, to the idea that of necessity a communist party had to be illegal in a capitalist country. Such false conceptions were strengthened by the fact that the left-wing non-citizen immigrant workers were victimized by arbitrary deportation and needed all possible protection from ruthless reaction. The American Labor Alliance. The Communist Party, as the basic champion of democracy, always strives to carry on its activities in the greatest possible publicity, in order most effectively to reach the masses with its message. This was the fundamental orientation of the CPUSA. During this difficult formative period, the party, as best it could, moved toward winning for itself the prevailing popular democratic rights of free speech and free assembly, in spite of all the barbarous persecution to which it was subjected. And it eventually succeeded in this endeavor. Nevertheless, the opportunities for mass communist work were being neglected because of sectarian moods in the party. The May 1921 CP Convention correctly declared, far greater and much more effective use of legal channels can and must be made. Our legal activities, always under the control of the Central Executive Committee of the CP, should be amplified and intensified. In line with this decision, the Workers' League was set up in New York City, and it ran candidates in the fall elections of 1921. Attempts by the local election board to disqualify these candidates on the grounds that they were either in jail or indicted were defeated. The party also began to take an active part openly in various current local political struggles. The party's first organizational step toward a fully open status, however, was taken with the establishment of the American Labor Alliance. This body was set up, rather tentatively to begin with, at an open convention in New York City in July 1921. There were 15 organizations present, including the Irish American Labor League, National Defense Committee, Finnish, Socialist, Federation, Associated, Toiler, Clubs, American Freedom Foundation, Ukrainian Workers' Clubs, Independent, Socialist League, Marxian Educational League, Hungarian Workers' Federation. The ALA convention elected Elmer L. Allison as secretary and established headquarters at 201 West 13th Street. The alliance declared that its aim was to unify, through a central body, the great mass of discontented, left, political and economic forces of the country and rally them about a common aim. Later, and more specifically, the ALA stated that it is of the opinion that the time is ripe for the organization of the class-conscious workers of America into a new revolutionary party, and it announces that in the near future it will call a national conference to form such a party. To this general end, one of the essential moves of the ALA was to come to an agreement with the Workers' Council. The Workers' Council, after the big split in the Socialist Party in 1919, which led to the formation of the two communist parties, there remained a number of opposition elements within the SP who were still nursing the hope of using that organization as the working class party. This tendency was led by J. Louis Engdahl, Alexander Trachtenberg, William Cruz, Margaret B. Prevey, and M. Olgin. Numerous centrists also went along, including Salutsky and others. The lefts in this group made the serious error of not leaving the SP with their following immediately upon the formation of the Communist Party in 1919. At the Chicago SP Convention, in September 1919, this group was responsible for the passage of a resolution making a qualified, originally unqualified, application for affiliation to the Comintern. The latter sharply rejected this, stating that the Socialist Party of the United States is not a working-class party, but an auxiliary of the American bourgeoisie, of American imperialism. At the New York Convention of the SP, in May 1920, the Engdahl-Trachtenberg group was again defeated, although Trachtenberg, candidate for international secretary against Hillquit, received 1/3 of all votes cast. This group supported the nomination of Debs, then in jail, by the convention, Victor Berger, who favored Hone, declaring that no American would vote for a man in jail. At that convention, the group functioned as the Committee for the Third International, which it had previously organized to carry on propaganda within the SP. They also formed, in May 1921, the Workers' Council, which was a functioning political organization, claiming the support of the Jewish, Finnish, and Czech federations, the German Workers' Educational Society, and a part of the Italian Federation. It also received the support of groups of English-speaking members throughout the country who still belonged to the Socialist Party and who were in favor of affiliation with the CI. In June 1921, the SP held its convention in Detroit. The convention declared against the Communist International, against the dictatorship of the proletariat, and against mass action. Whereupon, the Workers' Council group belatedly quit the Socialist Party. In an article in their official journal, entitled, "Farewell to the Socialist Party," they declared, "The Committee for the Third International sees no further reason for staying in the Socialist Party." It believes that the Socialist Party has completely and beyond recovery outlived its usefulness as an agency for propaganda and as an instrument for the realization of socialism. During this period the SP suffered a series of losses, in addition to the withdrawal of the Workers' Council. Most important, the Finnish Federation, with several thousand members, seceded on December 20, 1920. The Jewish Federation followed suit in September 1921. And 1 week prior to this the Bohemian Federation had voted by 10-1 to withdraw from the Socialist Party. 2. From 1920 to 1922, the SP declined from 27,000 to 11,000 members. The wholesale splittings from the Socialist Party in 1919 to 21 left Debs almost the sole prominent left still within the party. He cut a tragic figure, this one-time battler for the left who had been such a brilliant propagandist for socialism but who was now unable to follow the path toward socialism. When the big communist split was developing early in 1919, Debs kept silent, making no statements as to his position. In the basic conflict within the party. Evidently, however, while supporting the Russian Revolution, he did not understand the dictatorship of the proletariat because of his bourgeois democratic prejudices, nor could he realize that his old co-workers in the leadership of the SP were in actuality enemies of socialism. He was in jail when the 1919 split took place. D. Karsner, who visited Debs at his home and at the Atlanta Penitentiary, states that the latter said to him, "I do not see any difference between the Workers' Party and the Socialist Party," and he proposed a fusion of the two parties. Debs is also reputed to have told Karsner, "I have arrived at the definite conclusion that my place in the future as in the past is in the Socialist Party." Whatever he may have said to Karsner, the fact is that Debs remained in the bankrupt Socialist Party until he died on October 20, 1926. Formation of the Workers' Party. The American Labor Alliance, with the active support of the Communist Party, began, in August 1921, to charter locals for a new organization. At the same time the Workers' Council, which supported the plan for such a party, also began organizational work to the same end. On October 15, the Workers' Council issued a call for a conference to consider the possibilities of forming the new party. In consequence, the American Labor Alliance and the Workers' Council, after considerable negotiation, got together and issued a joint call to establish a new party. The call was endorsed by the following organizations: American Labor Alliance and its affiliated bodies, the Finnish Socialist Federation, Hungarian Workers' Federation, Italian Workers' Federation, and the Jewish Workers' Federation, the Workers' Council of America, Jewish Socialist Federation, and Workers' Educational Association, German. The call was signed by Elmer L. Allison, for the Workers' Party Convention Committee. Accompanying the convention call was a statement of principles, which the participating organizations were required to approve. It read, A. The Workers' Republic. To lead the working masses in the struggle for the abolition of capitalism through the establishment of a government by the working class, a workers' republic in America. G. Political action. To participate in all political activities, including electoral campaigns, in order to utilize them for the purpose of carrying our message to the masses. The elected representatives of the Workers' Party will unmask the fraudulent capitalist democracy and help mobilize the workers for the final struggle against their common enemy. 3. The labor unions. To develop labor organizations into organs of militant struggle against capitalism, expose the reactionary labor bureaucrats, and educate the workers to militant unionism. 4. A fighting party. It shall be a party of militant, class-conscious workers, bound by discipline and organized on the basis of democratic centralism, with full power in the hands of the Central Executive Committee between conventions. The Central Executive Committee of the party shall have control over all activities of public officials. It shall also coordinate and direct the work of the party members in the trade unions. 5. Party press. The party's press shall be owned by the party, and all its activities shall be under the control of the Central Executive Committee. The convention for the new party was convened at the Labor Temple on East 84th Street, New York, December 23 to 26, 1921. There were 150 delegates from all over the country. Among the most important organizations represented, with power to affiliate, were, in addition to the American Labor Alliance and the Workers' Council proper, the Russian, Finnish, South Slavic, Ukrainian, Irish, German, Greek, Jewish, Italian, Estonian, Spanish, Armenian, Lettish, Scandinavian, and Hungarian federations and sections. There were also fraternal delegates from such organizations, among others, as the Proletarian Party, Left Coalition, Young Workers' League, and the African Blood Brotherhood. The convention acted for a combined membership of some 20,000 in the fully accredited organizations, which issued 9 daily and 21 weekly publications. The convention was opened by J. Louis Engdahl, who in a short address greeted the delegates and dealt with the historic significance of the gathering as opening a new epoch in the struggle of the American working class. He welcomed the delegates from the various groupings, who for many years had been traveling different roads and had finally come together and found common ground in the joint effort to build a real revolutionary party in America. The 3 days of discussion that followed revealed substantial agreement on all major questions of principles and tactics. The only important differences were those raised by the 3 fraternal delegates from the Proletarian Party. They criticized the whole project of the convention from a narrow, leftist, sectarian viewpoint, claiming that their own tiny organization would suffice as the party of the working class. The Proletarian Party later refused to affiliate with the new party. The new organization was named the Workers' Party of America. Plans were made for the early publication of an official organ, the Worker. A central executive committee of 17 members was elected. Ruthenberg was chosen secretary, but since he was in jail, Caleb Harrison, appointed assistant secretary, was named to serve as acting secretary. New York City was designated as the seat of the national headquarters. The Workers' Party program. The Workers' Party Convention of 1921 constituted a very important stage in the history of the developing Communist Party of the United States. It established the long-sought unity of practically all the communist forces in the country, and it also marked the conclusion of the founding phase of the Communist Party. It ended the period of almost exclusively socialist propaganda and initiated the new party into the beginnings of mass work. It dealt a number of blows at the traditional sectarianism of the left wing by working out an elementary program of immediate demands. It marked, especially, an important step in the open work of the party. In short, the convention registered real progress in the adaptation of Marxism-Leninism to the specific conditions of the class struggle in the United States. Enemies of the party, such as James O'Neill, have tried to interpret the founding of the Workers' Party and the adoption of its specific program as an abandonment of the Leninist line of the communists. But this was nonsense. The whole development represented the normal growth of the party in its historic task of combining socialist propaganda with a militant struggle for the everyday needs of the workers and the masses of the people. The WP program, for the first time in a generation of left-wing history, contained what might properly be termed both a maximum and a minimum program. It did not confine itself simply to outlining the basic program of communism. The main principles of the organization were stated in the document that accompanied the call for the convention. These, see page 190, expressed in simple terms the general socialist aims of the party without, however, defining in detail the general perspectives and strategy of the party, which had so much occupied the attention of previous communist conventions. In this respect, the program declared, the Workers' Party will courageously defend the workers and wage an aggressive struggle for the abolition of capitalism. The convention also gave a ringing endorsement to the Russian Revolution, which had ushered in a new period, the era of workers' republics, and it demanded recognition of the Soviet government by the United States. After making a concrete analysis of the world setting in which the United States found itself and of the general position of American imperialism, the program proceeded to outline a course of practical mass struggle. The trade union question occupied nearly half the space in the program. After dealing with the shameful desertion of the workers by their social democratic leaders in the current bosses' offensive, the program called upon all workers to join the union of their trade, to form minority groups of left-wing workers within the unions, to work for fighting programs in the organizations, and to depose the reactionary union leadership. The program condemned dual unionism and all ideas of destroying the old craft unions. It supported the amalgamation of the trade unions into industrial organizations. On the Negro question, much progress was registered over the past neglect of this vital matter. Under the head of the race problem, the program, beginning with an analysis of the history of Negro oppression in the South, went on to say that the Workers' Party will support the Negroes in their struggle for liberation, and will help them in their fight for economic, political, and social equality. It will point out to them that the interests of the Negro workers are identical with those of the white. It will seek to end the policy of discrimination followed by organized labor. Its task will be to destroy altogether the barrier of race discrimination that has been used to keep apart the black and white workers, and weld them into a solid union of revolutionary forces for the overthrow of their common enemy. While falling short of an understanding of the Negro question as a national question, this was the most advanced resolution on the matter ever adopted by any Marxist party in the United States up to that time. The resolution on the youth provided that the CEC, Central Executive Committee, of the WP appoint a Provisional National Organization Committee to amalgamate all existing militant young workers' organizations, to create new ones wherever possible, and to carry on all work preparatory to the calling of a national convention which will unite these forces and officially launch the Young Workers' League of America. Pursuant to this resolution, a conference was held a couple of months later and the proposed league was established. A further resolution declared that the Workers' Party recognizes the necessity for an intensified struggle to improve women's conditions and to unify them in the common struggle with the rest of the working class against capitalism. It was to take the initiative in organizing and leading them in struggle. The convention pledged its support to the workers in agriculture. It also denounced the frame-ups against Mooney and Billings, and Sacco and Vanzetti, and it called upon the workers to fight for their freedom. Debs had been freed by President Harding, under strong mass pressure, and to him the convention said, "We greet with joy your homecoming from prison, and fervently hope that you will soon again be fighting in the ranks of the American working class in their struggle for emancipation." On the question of parliamentary action, the program, while pledging participation in elections and in the general political life of the country, still displayed heavy indications of the traditional left sectarianism by considering parliamentary action exclusively as a means of exposing capitalism and of conducting socialist agitation. The partial demands worked out for the elections and for other phases of the workers' struggles were altogether inadequate and in no sense presented a rounded-out program for the day-to-day struggle. The party, as yet, also took no steps toward participation in that broad mass political activity of the American working class, the Labor Party. The party asserts its democratic rights. The establishment of the Workers' Party was an important step in winning the democratic rights of the communist movement after it had been stripped, in its two original sections, of free speech and assembly by the ferocious Palmer raids of January 1920. But this progress was not achieved without a serious split in the Communist Party. Three members of the Central Executive Committee, believers in the theory that, of necessity, the communist movement had to be underground in a country such as the United States, took the position that the very existence of the Workers' Party would tend to liquidate the Communist Party both programmatically and organizationally. So they took a flat stand against this policy and developed a factional struggle to support their point of view. All attempts at resolving the differences having failed, the rebellious dissident group was suspended on November 2, 1921. On February 3, 1922, the ousted group, under the name of the Workers' Defense League of New England, issued a call for a national conference, to be held in New York City on February 18. Here was formed the United Toilers of America, which, with a leftist line, was sharply opposed to the newly organized Workers' Party. The new party set up headquarters in New York and issued the Workers' Challenge as its official organ. The United Toilers had a small following, mostly in the New York area, but it claimed a membership of 5,000. The movement was liquidated at the Bridgman CP Convention of August 1922, nearly all of its members returning to the party. After the formation of the Workers' Party in December 1921, the fight to establish in practice the democratic rights of the Communist Party proceeded apace. This question was the central issue at the party convention in Bridgman, Michigan, in mid-August of 1922. Given the continuing post-war offensive of the employers against the whole labor movement, however, the convention, by a close vote, decided against liquidating the underground aspects of the party. In the existing factional lineup, the majority group, led by Catterfeld and others, were known as the Goose Caucus, and they called the minority group, led by Ruthenberg, the Liquidators. As an indication that the government's attempt to outlaw the party was not yet over, the party convention was raided on August 22 by agents of the FBI and the state of Michigan, just as it had concluded its deliberations and was dispersing. 17 delegates were arrested with 4 more jailed later on. They were all charged with violating the Michigan anti-syndicalist law, concretely, with unlawful assembly. This was the beginning of a long legal fight, see next chapter, to win for the party the elementary democratic right of freely presenting its program to the American people. However, the conditions, marked by the illegal force and violence of the authorities, which had deprived the party of its democratic rights, were changing. A new turn was developing in the general political situation, as we shall see in ensuing chapters, with the employers' offensive against the working class assuming less violent forms. The opportunity was, therefore, at hand for the party to reach its desired goal of a completely public existence. Consequently, on April 7, 1923, the Communist Party declared its full consolidation with the Workers' Party. Thus, the underground period of the Communist Party, forced upon it by the barbarities of the Palmer raids, came to an end after 29 months. At its 1925 convention, the Workers' Party changed its name to the Workers' Communist Party and, finally, at its 1930 convention, to the Communist Party of the United States. The winning of its elementary legal rights of free speech and assembly by the Communist Party was an important victory for democracy in the United States.